Okay. We are now officially recording. And yes, so Seth, you just convene the meeting. I'll read roll call in alphabetical order, and please respond with present in person or online. Seth Barnes.
Present in person.
David Bugney.
Present in person.
Adam Coble.
Present in person.
Stacy Detweiler.
Present in person.
Julie Furman. Yeah, she's not here.
She's not in the room.
Thank you. Wendy Gerlach.
Present in person.
Kim Kratz. He is not online. Casey Kula.
Present in person.
Jason Robeson.
Present virtually.
Josh Seeds.
Present in person.
Amanda Sullivan Astor.
Present in person.
And William Tucker.
Present in person.
Okay, great. Actually, David, could you go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint so we can look at the
Sure.
agenda together? And then introducing Kyle is part of this in a moment. So we'll he's on the agenda officially. So we'll get the other one.
Yes. Thank you. There's one person who's not Kim. Acknowledge.
Hey, Terry, maybe if we could we get just a quick introduction of those who are not members of the committee but are present at the meeting? Just ODF
Sure.
staff and others.
Sure.
So we have a sense for who's here.
Yep. Why don't we start with the folks in the room, and then I can call out people on virtually.
So go ahead, Kyle, and we'll kind of go counterclockwise there.
Yep,
In the
thanks.
room.
Kyle Abraham, I serve as one of the 2 deputy division chiefs. I'm in charge of forest practices and monitoring for the Forest Resource Division. I'll talk a little bit more as well.
David Showalter, staff support for me.
Jacob Wise, ODF staff support.
Okay, that's it for in here. How about online?
Sure, Jennifer.
Hi there, I'm Jennifer Weichel, and I'm the Habitat Conservation Plan Coordinator for Private Forest Accord HCP.
Great. Sean.
Sean Gordon, I'm at the OSU Institute for Natural Resources and providing staff support for the Independent Research and Science team.
Great. Lisa.
Hi, Lisa Debricare. I facilitate the IRST.
And then I've got a WANNEBO, Winabo. You're on mute. Okay. They're not chiming in. Cynthia's iPhone.
Hi, Cindy Robert with Manulife Forest Management. I'm just like an AMPC groupie and had to be here.
Okay, great. And then I've got Sam Bankston.
See if I can get that right. Hey folks, Sam Bankston, fish biologist with Fisheries.
Great, welcome. I believe that's everyone.
Did we get Lisa? I think she just joined, and then Jay Wise.
Jay Wise is me.
Oh, okay. All right. We got Jay Wise. How about Lisa?
Yeah, Lisa Debricare we got. Am I missing?
No.
Okay. Great. If you could just fast forward to the agenda then.
Sure.
Wow.
So just a quick reminder, this is what's on the agenda for today. Roll call, all the beginning stuff under Roman numeral 1, effectiveness monitoring and research strategy discussion, addressing the feedback and questions on the roads question package from the IRST, and then process for proposing research questions. Next slide. So just a reminder in terms of housekeeping, these meetings are public and recorded. So instead of minutes, using the recording, which will be online within a few days. If you're joining us virtually, please turn on your camera because it helps with the discussion and things like reading the temperature for coming to decisions. Side conversations make it hard to hear on the recording, especially for those of us virtually. If there's a bunch of people talking at once in the conference room, it's a little challenging to understand. And then for those of us online, please mute when you're not speaking. Restrooms and exits, I think everyone in the room knows where those are, and the building doors do lock, just to be aware of that. Next slide. Yeah, this is where we take public comment. Any public comment? Okay. Not hearing any. So the executive summary of the previous meeting. You folks ready to accept that?
Any discussion? All right, not hearing any, seeing any, and we don't take formal votes on this, right, Terry?
Correct.
It's just a summary. So if there's no objection to it, then I think by virtue of that, we're accepting it, right? Say here otherwise.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Jason Robinson said no objections, just for the record.
Perfect.
And then I'll hand it over to Kyle for his introduction and talking about the Adaptive Management Program supervisor position.
Great, thanks, Jerry. Thanks, co-chairs. It's good to see everybody on this Eclipse Monday morning. So like I mentioned before, my name is Kyle Abraham. I currently serve as the Deputy Division Chief for Forest Practices Monitoring in the Forest Resource Division. I know several of you from different positions and experience with ODF, but for folks that don't know me, I originally started with ODF in 1998, working on electrofishing surveys when we used to do those for fish residence and absence. And then through a number of positions, I've worked in the field as a stewardship forester. I've worked quite a few years in the monitoring program here at ODF. Some of you may be familiar with Ripstream project. I kind of helped get that started. And so through various career changes, actually saw that to completion with the rule change, which was pretty unique experience from where that started to where it ended. And then I also worked for the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board as their effectiveness monitoring coordinator for a few years, and then actually came sort of back to ODF in 2012 as a water quality specialist. I was the deputy division chief for a few years, division chief, and then I'm sure a lot of folks know the deputy state forester role. I was in that job for a couple of years and chose to kind of reset my work-life balance, and there was a position that was open here, so I decided to come back. And I can tell you that there are a lot of changes in the division, a lot of things that we're working through. I've been pretty close to some of the initial conversations around the PFA and the report and those sorts of things. And so just to see all of that come into fruition and the number of resources that the division now has with respect to field staff, training, civil penalties, enforcement, it's just a significant amount of work that happened in a couple of years, which is great. But I can tell you that there are still some things that we're working through on the implementation side. And so as you guys can all imagine, nothing is perfect the first time you set things out, but we are working through a number of things this year to make sure that we have clear direction internally and with the landowners and operators for implementing all of those new rule changes and policy changes. So anyway, it's kind of interesting to come back to a place where so many significant changes have happened, and just to see how folks have kind of adapted to that and started to work with new programs and resources, so. I also wanted to mention that we did have, sort of in the breadth of changes, we did have a departure of one of our unit managers that was handling the adaptive management program and supervising Terry. And she was also supervising the civil penalties and the training unit. So she departed. I am temporarily sort of supervising those functions in addition to my other duties. And as we sort of walk through and kind of talk through what the restructure or any sort of restructure as we have departures, we want to make sure that we're looking at the breadth of things that we do within the division. So we'll be talking with the managers about any future realignment or discussions that we want to have to better align some of the functions. And I'm not, I say that as sort of like the de facto, we're going to make changes, but we may not. So we may end up with the same structure. It's just the right time we kind of look at things and see how they're working. So, but in the meantime, like I said, I'll be kind of supervising those roles, and Terry's been great, kind of getting me up to speed. I have a lot to learn on the adaptive management program and the intersection between OST and AMC and positions and committees. So Terry's been great, trying to help me kind of educate me and kind of move me along a little bit with all the details. So that's been super helpful. I'd also mention a little bit around the effectiveness monitoring program that you guys are going to kind of talk through today. I mean, first off, it's just really exciting to sort of have the opportunity to talk about that with respect to the HCP and some of the long-term trends and status that we would want to see as we're trying to first off implement the HCP and the set of rule changes. We had talked about that a number of years ago in the monitoring program for a long-term status and trend program, but resources have always been sort of limiting in that respect. And so just in terms of how it connects to the HCP and the biological goals and objectives, Jennifer's going to talk more about that, but the department is super excited. I'm super excited about that opportunity, and I think it will help us deliver on some of the long-term HCP goals. And then really, where do we think that some of these changes are going to support sustainable forests in the future? So I probably talked really fast, and there's a lot there. I kind of rambled a little bit, but if folks have any questions about the division's perspective of our engagement in this program, you can ask those now or reach out to me at some point in the future. So always trying to be a resource and provide perspective and answer questions for folks inside and outside the department. But I'm super happy to be here, kind of listen to where things are going. I know the Board of Forestry is still pretty excited about the collaboration and folks working together on this team to address policy related questions, monitoring questions. So there's a lot of excitement and opportunity.
Welcome back to forest practices. Opportunity to dig into the details.
Yeah. Look forward to it.
Thanks for speaking.
Oh, absolutely.
Go ahead.
I didn't put my thing. Hey Kyle, good to see you. So can you help us understand, as you've been getting up to speed, your engagement and what that's been like with the HCP process?
Yeah, so I've been sort of spanning a little bit between the operational side, which is kind of the focus of my role, and also HCP development. So that, kind of reviewing chapters, helping to draft some of the language for specific chapters, helping Jennifer out on responding to questions, and so I've been involved there as well.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot going on that front as well. You can imagine.
Yeah, and we've talked a little bit in this group, and I don't know, the for you guys as co-chairs, we've talked a little bit about, sort of at some point wanting an update on the actual PTOs. Any formal
And
update on that?
I think somewhat, Jennifer's gonna speak
Okay.
to some of that
Okay, great.
today. But I mean, just know, so Stacy, myself, Casey, Jennifer, obviously, are heavily steeped in HCP conversations. The draft chapters are coming together. It's a lot of work, a lot of review, a lot of drafting. And the draft itself we're still June, it's like the time,
End of June, we're still on track for July.
so. And then that'll be out public and everything else. I mean, it really is just a collaboration between authors and the landowner, or authors and the agency at this point, trying to figure out, trying to get it all packaged so they can be delivered. But we'll have the first discussion we're gonna have today has a really, close nexus with all of that, so.
And at least I don't think that I don't think that the BGO that are kind of in draft form right now that are getting submitted, I don't think much of it is different in substance for what we need to know than what we have in our email. I took a look and I was like, how does this differ? And now it's the stuff that we need to know is in there.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
the embassy.
That's good. At some point, we'll have to level set for the people that aren't.
Yeah.
And I will offer that Jennifer has provided some overview of the process and sort of where we're at, but in addition to the rest of the timelines for the Southwest Regional Forest Practice Committee. I think that was a few weeks ago, it feels like, and then also Southern Oregon Native Conference, sort of internal field foresters, just to give folks the perspective that we've done a lot. There's a lot of things that have been sort of implemented, but there's still a lot to do, so that people don't feel like things are sort of done and over.
Yeah.
There are some things I could offer other communities to do their process out.
Thank you. So, Terry, are you still walking us through the?
Yeah.
Here?
Yeah, there's really just this next reminder of what's ahead, and this is what's on the agenda for June. That's subject to change. So consider this the draft agenda, talking more about amphibians, finalizing Eastern Oregon steep slopes question package, and then discussing the effectiveness monitoring and research strategy. And then this is just a reminder of the remaining AMC meetings in 2024. Should be on everyone's calendars. Next slide. And so this is where we're going to get into the development, talking about the development of effectiveness monitoring and research strategy. And I've got the and research in parentheses because I think there's some question of, are we just focusing on monitoring at this moment or including research in sort of a big picture way? And Kyle just shared the big picture there a moment ago. And before we hand it over to Jennifer, Stacy, Seth, is there anything you want to mention about this?
Yeah, I guess just thank you for Jennifer and Kyle for joining and providing some of this context. To your point, Amanda, trying to, as much as our role is to focus on the priority research areas, our role as AMC is also to look at how the roles are they effectively meeting those BGOs? And as the HCP is kind of moving forward, we've still got this on track for this end of June deadline to get that finished and off to the services, really emphasizing the importance of kind of getting AMC as well aligned and thinking about how our role fits into the HCP context as well. So that was sort of the impetus for this conversation. I'm sure there'll be lots of good discussion, and thanks again to Jennifer. I don't know if you have anything.
No, this idea of effectiveness monitoring and sort of the trends monitoring, if you will, has come up multiple times in our discussions over the last year, but we haven't ever really had a, you know, cohesive conversation about what it is and whether, and how to prioritize it and how to wrap our arms around it and get something started. And so, and this, as you'll hear, has come up more and more in the discussions of the HCP around the biological goals and objectives. And we just felt like it was time to have this full conversation with this group and sort of figure out how do we start down this road effectively, and not just dance around it. So I have a lot of hope that I think we're in pretty good alignment based on some of the, you know, early conversations that we've had and touching on it here and there. I think most people have in mind that this is a part of our charge. But it's not quite the same thing as like wrapping our arms around like a single question, you know, about temperature or whatever. It's more of a collective monitoring effort. So with that, I guess I would turn it over to Jennifer to fill in more of the details.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I don't have a PowerPoint today. I'm just gonna chat at you. I appreciate being able to be here and talk about this with the group. What I want to do is just kind of a little bit of reminder of basics about how the HCP and the forest practices rules and AMC and IRST works is all combined. And then a little bit more into some details on the HCP and the effectiveness monitoring program. And then I'm plenty of time for you guys to have a discussion and I can answer any questions. Feel free to just chime in and interrupt me if there's questions along the way. So yeah, as Kyle mentioned, this is a great opportunity that we have, this program in place, and it's the first time, well, it's not the first time we've had effectiveness monitoring for forest practices rule, but at the scale, it's really something new for the department. Just a reminder that, the rules really set the policy that, it's right in rule is the policy of the state that we're supposed to monitor for effectiveness of the rules to meet the biological goals and objectives. And so right off the bat in the rule that directs the AMC work, you've got the combination of forest practices rules and HCP. And so even though the terminology HCP is not in that policy statement, the biological goals and objectives are in the HCP. So it's really connected. You can't really separate out the forest practices rules that are related to PFA from the HCP. It's all combined. So it's all part of the same process, the same objectives. So another reminder really high up is that, I realize nobody's seen the HCP. It will be out. We're still on target for end of June. One quick correction though to what you said, Seth, for the record, is it's actually not going to be a public draft. It's the draft that's going to the services for their initial input and review. So I just wanted to make that clear. It's not, the public draft will be out later in 2025. So just for the record. But the HCP has two primary components for monitoring, and they really go hand in hand. The compliance monitoring program is the other piece, and that program is really looking at, are we implementing the conservation measures or the private forest accord rules as intended? And then the effectiveness monitoring is, are we achieving the intended outcomes? And the language again is meeting the BGO. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. So, as it's laid out in the rule, there's not a whole lot of direction on exactly what it is that's supposed to be looked at for effectiveness monitoring. You obviously have the 3 key priorities, but really what the effectiveness monitoring for the HCP is so much larger than that. And so the direction has been sort of right off the get-go, focusing in on those three priorities. But when you think about the HCP and all the conservation measures, all the private forest accord changes, there is a lot to be accomplished there. And so I think, this group diving into thinking about this off the get-go is important, because there's going to be a lot of different questions to be answered. And there's no way it can all be done at once with the funding that we have. So there needs to be some strategy to tackle the questions. And so to the BGO piece, so am I correct, Terry, that this group you guys do have the original BGOs in
Yes.
hand, right? Okay, thank you. So those have not changed. Those are in the current draft of the HCP are the same. But what's being worked on in the background right now, and it's not fleshed out enough to share yet, is a whole nother piece of it. It's called BGO metrics. And so it'll be a part of the adaptive management chapter of the HCP, but not quite ready to share. And so what that does is going to lay out, it's going to flush out each of those biological goals and objectives to a little bit more of what is the intended work to be done. So what is the intended next step down for effectiveness monitoring? And in that we have the status and trend monitoring, focused effectiveness monitoring if needed, and then targeted research. So each BGO is going to have those things identified. I will say though that some of the BGOs that work the metrics to be identified and the status and trend monitoring is being kicked to either the AMC group or to IRST through AMC. So it's going to be, once that document is shared with the group, I think that's going to help you guys a lot to see what exactly is being asked of AMC for effectiveness monitoring. Sorry,
That makes sense.
my notes again. What's that?
Do
Someone have a
people-
question?
I'm sorry, I understand what Jennifer's saying, because I've in all the meetings, does that make sense to folks who? The other question, okay.
Okay. Thanks for asking that, Casey. I tend to.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, I was like,
I
I'm
tend to
hearing
dive
you.
right into the weeds. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, unfortunately, I wish I could share this with you, but I cannot. The HCP, this project is very interesting in that there's a lot happening in parallel. And so it makes it a bit awkward because AMC is up and running, IRST is up and running while we're actually writing the HCP. So we have, different pieces happening in parallel. On a normal HCP, you would really work mostly on the document first, and then that would inform the pieces, but this is just a different beast. So just for an example, just wanted to share a couple of examples for what a status and trend monitoring might be. And Stacy and Seth, please chime in here and add in as needed, and Casey as well. The BGO metric piece is really in the hands of the Private Forest Accord Coalition authors for taking lead. They had lead right in the actual PFA report. It was identified that the BGOs were going to be developed by the Private Forest Accord authors. So even though I'm looped in, I'm not into the weeds in it. So one of the BGOs, for example, that you have in front of you is talking about stream shade sufficient to support desired cool water temperatures in fish bearing streams. So I think part of what's being envisioned here for status and trend monitoring would be looking at stream temperature over a larger landscape to identify whether we're maintaining and trending towards meeting the biologically based numeric criteria for SM audits. And then there's a different threshold or different target for Eastern Oregon. And another one that's obvious, a little bit more obvious, for status and trend monitoring has to do with fish passage. And so for that, an obvious thing to look at over a large landscape to look at whether we're on target for meeting trends, would be reduction of fish passage barriers, for example. And so in some cases, some of the status and monitoring data, we may be able to pull from existing resources such as ODF&W's program. The fish passage barrier one, our own FRIA program is really going to help inform that. So I think, as AMC and IRST work towards answering these questions and figuring out what the status and trend monitoring needs to be and what the metrics need to be, it's going to take some creative thinking, looking at what data is also available out there.
You have a
So,
question?
yeah,
In
go
the
ahead.
room.
I was just sorry. What's that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question, and then Julie came, so do you want Julie to introduce herself first?
Sure, thank you. Julie, I see that can you just say your name and that you're present by video? I see that you're here now.
Yeah, Julie Furman from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, present by video.
Thank you. All right, Amanda had a question.
So I might have a stupid question. So what is the responsibility of ODF compared to NOAA Fisheries and Fish and Wildlife on the monitoring piece? Because I have to imagine in order to maintain the incidental take permit and for the comfortability of the federal services, I'm just trying to like suss that out, right? Like where does the risk, seems like a lot of the responsibility lies within the permittee rather than the permitter. But can somebody help me understand where Fish and Wildlife and NIMS kind of into that?
Yeah, let me take a first stab at that, and then Sam, I don't know if you want to chime in if I get anything wrong here, but essentially we're, the department, the state is the one asking for incidental take permits. So it's really our responsibility to do the monitoring and to, in the document itself, we have to really lay out exactly what it is we're planning to do so that the services will feel confident that we have both the effective compliance monitoring program to really track implementation on the ground, and then the effectiveness monitoring program so that we know whether those conservation measures, or in this case, the private forest accord rules, are achieving the intended outcomes to, minimize and reduce effects and minimize chance of take happening in the first place. And so it really falls on us. And so the services will look at what we propose, and then hopefully through the document review of this draft that'll come out in June, give us an idea of whether the effectiveness monitoring program that we have laid out in the document is going to be adequate, and if not, where are the gaps?
Okay, so it sounds like their role is more in reviewing and then approving by means of developing the ROD and the issuance of ITP.
That's
for like the methodology.
So NOAA won't do any monitoring themselves, or US Fish won't do any monitoring themselves specific to our HCP. That's our responsibility to figure out how we're going to do that and make it happen.
Okay, but that's good. Based on the explanation, obviously they're going to look at it, but they do that's a part, I guess, of the package of approval or not really within the ROD and the ITP issuance. So, okay, that's helpful. Sorry for my.
No, that was a really good question. That was a really good question, because what you're asking is really the impetus for why we're talking about this now, is so that we can start to figure out what this is going to look like, and ultimately get it right in the document, so that we have the nuts and bolts, at least, of the program fleshed out at some point here. It probably won't be by June, but as far as the details, like we'll have the framework in June, but the nuts and bolts details might come in the next draft.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay, got another question here, Stacy, and then
Yeah.
David.
I was just gonna add on, I think you kind of covered that, Jennifer, but just thinking about it in terms of within the HCP, the assurances that we can provide as the state to the services. And like Jennifer, you just said, that's kind of one of the reasons we wanted to get this conversation going, so that we are making that progress as we're collectively drafting the HCP, so it's very clear that there's momentum there and there's a plan.
Just a quick question, we've been involved in, update or reviewing the fish pathogen status that ODFW has in their database, you know, and finding that it needs to be updated. There's a lot of errors in it, particularly, I can only speak to Clackamas River Basin, but there's things in there that need to be updated and corrected. I'm just wondering, is there funding or how will that, if you want to have a baseline begin from in order to determine how effective a program is, you want to have seems like a good starting point. And so will ODFW be given funding to be able to update that database, or how will it be so that you know that you've got a reliable database going forward?
I'm gonna try to answer this, and I might quickly kick this to Julie, but you know, as far as like what we're gonna use for status and trend monitoring, that's still an open question. And so the fish passage part of our BGOs, it's quite possible we would utilize some of the ODFW data. I'm not familiar with it personally, so I can't speak to the details. There's nothing right now in the program, I think, that directs any money to that program related to private forest accord. But I don't know if that will change over time. But nothing directly connected with, for example, the initial Senate bills. And so we might utilize that data, but if there's errors and gaps, then we might want to think about it. I mean, that's up to you guys to determine with IRST's help of how you're going to do status and trend monitoring. Is that particular database the right database to do that, as opposed to some of the internal data from ODF? So I can't really answer your question, but I hopefully helped a little. And I don't know if Julie has any information about that program in particular, that database.
I don't know that I'd have anything to add as far as which data set would be most appropriate for us to use. Because I'm not so familiar with ODF's data set on barriers either.
Yeah, that's a bit in the weeds question, so I don't know. Again, I'm not really the right person to answer it either, so.
Part of this will be sussed out as we work with the IRST and they try to use resources to figure out what's known and what's being collected and where are the gaps and that sort of thing. So we'll talk, I'm sure, a bunch more about that issue. Terry, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so one point is just when Jennifer's done with her piece, I've got a couple of things before sort of you folks really kick into the full AMP-C discussion. Then a question for Jennifer, you've kind of touched on it, but there's this, we're talking about developing an effectiveness monitoring strategy, which will be helpful for the HCP. Do you see that it's essential that that be done before either, what level of inclusion of that strategy is appropriate for the HCP, or it will be, or is it just sort of like you said, this is an unusual situation given all this DAF management program is up and running and the HCP is still being worked on. So if you could touch on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can try. The short answer is I don't know, Terry, to be totally honest. I mean, that's just kind of how I am. I would rather just be honest than try to make something up. I'm learning as I go with this HCP. This is my first time ever taking anything on, so that would be a question we might take to the services. I do think that for, you know, the actual draft that gets submitted to kick off, you know, when we do the notice of intent and the permit applications, we need to have enough detail in there so that the services are gonna understand what it is that we're proposing and planning. I don't know that we necessarily need the level of detail of, you know, this is exactly the measurement to be, the metric to be measured, at this level of resolution and statistical power, for example. You know, that might be in the weeds that would come later. I'm not really sure.
So part of this also, if I may, Jennifer, and I think a lot of us are in the same boat here, drafting this HCP, that we've never drafted one before. Certainly never drafted one like this. To my knowledge, I think there's only one other HCP like this in the entire country, and that's in Washington. And it was developed 20+ years ago. So with that in mind, I think that all of this is a work in progress, and whatever gets drafted up in the HCP, I think it's fair to say that that's a first draft, right? And that there would then be, if there was a need from the services to have more or in one area or another, that would be a discussion and a back and forth and an adjustment that could be made. All to say, I don't think we have to have everything like ironed out completely for this by June. That's my expectation anyway, understanding is that we start the ball, we start to move the conversation, and the HCP authors write what they can in there and what makes sense to them as they can agree to it. And then if there is more to add to it, that gets done, you know, in the months coming. But
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, what I've been told, what the expectation is from the services is that this will be somewhat of an iterative approach. And so we are working really, really hard to get as complete of a document as possible for June, meaning no big giant gaps. But there will be a lot of we're anticipating a lot of comments and questions to come back from the services when they review that draft. And then we're gonna have to do work to address all of those questions and fill in gaps that are identified. And so it will be a bit of an iterative approach.
and the other thing I would add, if I may, is that this is, as I said before, this is an unusual HCP. And so I think if you were to look at other HCPs that are more common with a given landowner, a very set land base where they're looking at, you won't find an AMSI and an IRST, for example, with each HCP, right? This obviously, this programmatic HCP is being done in such a way that it appropriately reflects a statewide program managing forest practices, which is a very different thing than, you know, just protection measures on 25,000 acres or something like that for a given species or two or three or whatever it happens to be. So there's much more to this, to writing this up and putting this together than is typical even for the federal services. So they're sorting their way through this as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's gonna be a learning process on both sides. And you're absolutely right. I mean, part of the challenge when it comes to monitoring, thinking about this HCP is just the sheer scope and scale. You know, one of my questions when it comes to the topic of status and trend monitoring is, well, how will that happen in a way that you get meaningful data out of it when you're really looking over a large landscape and, you know, many, many, many landowners. And so it's a huge project and it's a huge scale. I mean, there's the flip side of that is what an opportunity though, right? To be able to pull data together statewide on a program like this. I think it's pretty amazing. I just have one more thing to follow up on, and it ties in really closely here. Is just on this topic of the scope and scale of the HCP and the effectiveness monitoring program. You know, we have in total there's 14 objectives under the biological goals and objectives, and each of those will have one or more sub metrics and questions for, you know, the status and trend monitoring and effectiveness monitoring, and possibly the targeted research. And so that is, you scale that up, and then you think about the statewide and possibly how to break this out, you know, region wide or, you know, geographically to get some good data that's useful. It's a huge, huge question. And so that's why we need, you know, a strategy to really frame this up. There's only so much money and funds to go around. And so within the 14 BGOs, this group, I think, really needs to think about the prioritization and how to parse out that work over time. And I think some of that thought process can definitely happen now and will help inform the HCP as we move forward. So I just wanted to kind of end with that. And then we can just continue the dialogue and questions if there's any others.
Go ahead, Stacy.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jennifer. I think that's kind of moving maybe into the next phase of the conversation a little bit. You know, just thinking about our role as AMC and then working with IRST as well, and the resources they have and expertise that they have to kind of help frame out what that plan could look like. I think obviously we play a key role in the prioritization of that, but I'm very interested in what the science experts on IRST would say about leveraging, you know, if we're looking at things like temperature and large wood and shade, you know, they're all kind of connected. And so what synergies might exist? So I guess just encouraging, you know, thinking of ourselves as the full adaptive management program, right? Both AMC and IRST, and how we approach this question. And we've had some initial conversations around this, as you know, there's some similarities with sort of what we did with the roads question, running into the IRST. But obviously, this is much bigger in scale. And so starting to think through, it's not quite a research question, it's kind of, we've been calling it a research plan. There's maybe some other terminology, but what is sort of how do we discuss this with IRST so we get the information that we need that will help us to shape what this program looks like?
Does it make sense the difference that we're talking about here between like the research topic and questions that we've been focusing on and the monitoring side? I mean, I just want to make sure people are clear with that. Okay, good. Okay, Josh, go ahead.
So this raises a couple of interesting thoughts. I mean, interesting to me.
So it will become interesting to us.
You know, so one of the objectives, I'm glad to hear that there's going to be some of the adaptive management chapter, because looking at some of the objectives, how you assess that,
Yeah.
it seems like it could be a source of a lot of work for the AMC. Some of them are fairly general. And so then it's like, well, what does it mean to have, you know, efficient stream shape? That sounds like something that also specific, you know, metric or range that goes with it. So having metrics for that, I think, is really helpful. But then this kind of like brings up an interesting nuance, like, because right now, this is really the work of the PFA authors. Going forward, it's going to be the responsibility of the AMC. The more specific it is in the HCP, the less power the SMC or future AMC has. So there's like an interesting balance here. I think having more specificity is good, but I also think leaving more flexibility for a future AMC and IRST is also good. So, you know, it seems like that's a needle that will need to be threaded in the metrics and the biological goals and objectives, is to not constrain the adaptive management program too much in the future, but also to not leave too much work and too much kind of endlessly like debating, well, what does this mean for the future? The other thing I would throw out, just in terms of where DEQ's at, is so, you know, we've got our TMDL program, which is a whole lot to talk about, so I won't get into it. And we're also trying to get our coastal non-point control plan through federal agencies. So it's the coastal management side of NOAA, and then EPA, but then of course they're gonna have to consult with NIMS and US Fish and Wildlife because of the ESA implications of this. It's the state's coastal non-point control plan. So on the forestry side, that's really the FPA as it's been modified by the PFA, including the adaptive management program, compliance monitoring program, plus relying on DEQ's TMDL program to fill in any gaps or whatever. And so for the coastal zone stuff, it's not where you're definitely going to meet, you know, water quality standards and coastal management goals. It's that you've got a good program in place that can then change as new information becomes available. It's a very process oriented sort of thing. And so we, the state government, is trying to get that through and into the hands of the federal agencies this year. And so, you know, Adam Cobal's worked on that. So the additional management measures for forestry are really like, okay, how is the PFA and adaptive management program within ODF, the MDL program within DEQ going to meet those management measures? And so a lot of that for the federal agencies is going to be, you know, well, how are you going to measure this and how are you going to change over time if needed? And that's the question they're going to be asking. So this does also, I bring that up because the work we're doing here is something that, even though it's not Clean Water Act work, it's going to really tie into Clean Water Act and Clean Water Act related programs going forward. And on the coastal zones piece of it, in March, I was asked to present to our governing commission, the Environmental Quality Commission, about it. And the commissioners had a lot of questions about, you know, that stuff that I really wanted to like, I can't give you a black and white answer, but a lot of their questions sort of came down to, well, is the PFA enough from a Clean Water Act perspective? And what are the mechanisms within the private forest report work to, you know, get us there? And you know, well, what's the effectiveness monitoring approach, and how is the effectiveness monitoring going to tie into the water quality parameters and stream riparian structure parameters DEQ and the Environmental Quality Commission cares about? They really had a lot of questions about that, not just for forestry, also for agriculture. But there was a lot of focus from our commission on including forestry. So, you know, I realize this is really focused on the species, but then of course, a lot of our Clean Water Act standards are also focused on the same species. And so there's that interplay here that I think, you know, again, going back to my first point, we want enough specificity in the goals and objectives and metrics. We know what we're looking for, but we don't want so much that we get into one number or one target when the science change. I just think it sets up, I think this is setting up an interesting dynamic. I'm really interested to see the metrics are developed where we kind of come down in that balance between leaving too much work for the MC and not giving the control.
Adam, or actually Amanda will be next and then Adam.
So I have a similar question and maybe one other one from what Josh was talking about. So I guess my question is, who decides what the number is or the range is or the parameter is for effective? Right? Is that the author group or is that the federal services? Because where that number lies, or the top end or the bottom end of that range is really important, right?
Yeah.
So is that I guess, you know, you can't really measure or monitor effectiveness without knowing what the goal is, right? And we have these high level goals and objectives, but kind of the second step of the metrics, like Jennifer was talking about, is really where the rubber meets the road. So is that really the responsibility of the author group or the services? I guess that's my first question.
Well, I would say a couple things and then others can chime in as well. I think you can measure, you can monitor without having a, so it is possible to sort of get that trend information without having a hard, you know, number at some point. You can know that we are increasing shade. Now, is it enough? That's the question you're asking, but you can start to monitor and actually get trend information, which is still valuable and helpful information to then inform the question. So some of it we don't have metrics on. There just aren't metrics for some things like large wood. When do you have enough, right? And so that could then feed into a research question. When do you have enough large wood or whatever, right? I mean, that's just one and that's always kicked around out there, so I would say effectiveness, like the actual monitoring side of it does not always have to be completely coupled with knowing exactly what your metric is that you're trying to achieve. The trend itself can be the thing that you're trying to achieve. So, and then the second part is, I do think a lot of them you do want to have a metric on it. In some cases, we do have a metric where it's a fairly easy one to pull off a shelf. Others we don't, and that would lead to the research. And I think the metric discussion itself is a policy discussion. It has always been a policy discussion of whether it's informed by science. I'm not saying it's not informed by science, but ultimately choosing that metric and saying that's the goal is a policy decision. And so I would argue that that's an adaptive management program committee discussion. And I would think we will get there, to your point, Josh, as we move through this over time, whether it's us or future AMC members that are part of it, they will have those discussions on some of these metrics as they get research back that says, this is, or a literature review or whatever, and, we're honing in, this is the area, what do you all think? And let's have that discussion, what should we be aiming at here? So to some extent, I think that's some future work. But I think the AMPs or the authors are trying to look at what's available and that they can agree to it, and some of those will be put there for us, but there will be a number that I think will not, and will be part of the discussion or part of the work that this group works on.
And so as part of that, and this gets back to kind of my earlier question on where the services fall into it is, are they gonna be asking for kind of that lit review or annotated bib that comes along with the rationale for why those metrics are set? Because if they feel like this is like not actually where the scientific community is at on what is or is not effective, would they, I don't know the process. So is that something that they would come back and say, not just on the methodology piece, but on the metrics that are maybe set? I'm just asking process.
Go ahead. Yeah, so I've been on the scoping team, which is essentially the technical team for the Western Oregon State Forest HCP. And so like a specific example that keeps leaping out to me there as a metric is that the National Marine Fisheries Service really has, at least in that HCP process, been pretty this is what we're going for is on temperature.
Yeah.
And they're really, it's based on the same research as our water temperature standard, and the biological numeric criteria are just kind of our listing threshold. That's like the flashing red light threshold. But the real goal of our water quality standard is like the total change of 0.3 from anthropogenic sources. And that's what NIMS, who's part of the research behind it, way back in the 2000 odds. They're in the Western Oregon State Forest HCP, that's been their metric is no more than 0.3 degrees Celsius in the fish streams. And that's what they've really been focused on. And so like the riparian structure in this HCP is a riparian structure that you would build if you were focused on a goal like 0.3 in the fish bearing streams.
Yeah.
You know, like that kind of upstream reach on the small perennial type ends and then the wider bodies of fish, that's really like a minimizing change in the fish stream type setup. Which is good because that's what NIMS has really been focused on in the Western Oregon State Forest HCP, and they've really been, you know, like looking at, is this definitely gonna get to 0.3 for the state forest riparian population rates. So at least in that one, I know NIMS has had a pretty strong and opinion that is expressed as a number, as a specific number, but then when it's like large wood. Seth said, do we have a number? Then we kind of have a range, but Julie speak to that more.
Oh, we got a bit there.
But so I think that we're gonna find places where the services, like they do have a pretty fast opinion on what a metric should look like. At least based on my.
You got everybody's hand on. So let's go, Stacy in the room and then we'll start, and I didn't do that here. And then Stacy.
Well, so we brought up the Clean Water Act, I was talking about some of the metrics here. It seems like, well, you know, ODF is a designated management agency for implementing water quality management plans and TMDLs. And I think there's a lot of potential overlap there. And I know DEQ does a lot of effectiveness monitoring too, so it seems like there's tools there and potential data that could be used either as a starting point or thinking about how to go forward. So I just, you know, with both Clean Water Act and ESA coming from federal agencies, I guess, I don't know, are there discussions between EPA and NIMS and NOAA in terms of this is the HCP and this is, you know, these are like, because there's so much overlap here. Wondering if that's.
I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion moving forward about that. Stacy, and then we'll go online.
Yeah, just quickly to your question, Amanda, I think on the process side, I'd be curious if someone from NOAA's on as well to speak to this, but you know, there's all these conversations kind of in the spectrum of where there's more or less information for the metrics, where the science is more or less uncertain and kind of where that falls. And then there's this draft we'll have end of June that will go to the services for some kind of initial input. So there will be, I think, some back and forth before then the more formal public process, where I'll be really interested to hear, you know, is what is in the HCP as drafted enough? Are there still questions? Does there need to be more specificity in those metrics? And then I think also for me, seeing IRST as the science place to help define where there is not enough information currently, or it's uncertain, like for large wood, you know, how can we use the IRST to really dive into that question to develop some information for us to make a good policy decision based on science? You know, what are the metrics that are, you know, best supported, and then kind of prioritizing within that. So that's just sort of how I'm envisioning the process.
So just to follow up, I have 3, I guess, things that I identified, and maybe, you know, more people can get into these, but it sounds like some metrics might come directly from the feds based on other overlapping plans, requirements and statutes, et cetera, right? Like the temperature stuff. Some are gonna be, you know, up to the authors to dictate, which is a lot of those policy decisions, right? Where the science is there or mostly there, but there's a lot of opinions and political decisions that probably need to be made on weighing different levers, different things, right? And then the kind of third category or bucket that you just mentioned, really, Stacy, is like ones that the science isn't really settled. We're going to be looking at trends, or a trend might be what comes as far as the metric that leads to research that this body pursues with the IRST that then turns into, you know, AFC maybe recommending something to the board to bring into the each. Those are kind of the three main buckets, it sounds like, as far as who decides what is and is not
Yeah,
effective.
and I would say what the services are buying more or less, at some level, it's process,
Yeah.
right? They're buying into a process that's being put in place here, structure to help carry this forward and so, yeah, I think that's a big piece of it. I don't know who was first. Terry, could you help me out online? I've got
Yeah.
Terry.
I think I was first and just in order, but so just a couple of sort of big picture things to consider. So correct me if I'm wrong, Seth, but I think the discussion today is really, there's a lot of talk about which metrics and how to approach it and all this kind of stuff, which is really, really important. And I think today, the primary first question is, does everyone on the AMC agree that effectiveness monitoring strategy, developing an effective monitoring strategy is a priority of the AMC, combined with, hey, let's start a path to do that. So I think that's the primary question.
Yeah.
And then another sort of to piggyback on something I think Stacy said a few minutes ago, was that this isn't exactly a research question, so it doesn't fit neatly within the bucket of the adaptive management program rules, other than to say this is sort of other communication between AMC and IRST for program success. So there's a way still to say, to request information from the IRST that'll help in the development of this strategy, but isn't necessarily doing a scoping proposal and making it part of the research agenda, et cetera, or not all of it. So those are two key things. And I guess Stacy and Seth, if you could chime in on the first part about the focus of the question at hand for the AMPC today.
Yeah, what we really need to decide as a group is this a priority? Developing a monitoring plan, are we going to elevate that? The question before us, are we going to elevate that as a priority along with the other priorities that we've adopted? So the other ones that we still have, of course, working on the roads, amphibians, and east side literature review, east side slope literature review. A fourth that's now being put in front of us is potentially developing a monitoring plan. And that has a lot to it that we're delving into a little bit here. But really, in order to officially kickstart this and give us the time on our agendas and everything else to work on this and signal to the services and the authors and everybody else working on the HCP that we are taking this on. That's the question that's being asked before us. We'll be asked to vote on, do we all agree that this should be a priority equal to those other priorities over the coming months / however long it takes. Or, years, obviously. And we still have people online, so I don't want to.
Thank you, that was helpful though, sorry, Terry and Seth.
So let's go Julie Furman and then Jennifer. And then at some point, Terry, you said you wanted to talk with us before we started the discussion. We kind of started the discussion.
I think we've covered enough of what was they're in the PowerPoint slides. There's some bullet points to consider, but I think we're enough down the road that we don't need to go circle back to this.
Okay, Julie.
Yeah, well, I have to say I have a new appreciation of how difficult crosstalk makes it to understand what's going on in the room. So my apologies if I cover something that's already been discussed in the room, but and this is going back in the discussion a little bit, but just to address Amanda's question about who makes a decision about what thresholds are or not, or how we approach this. My experience and understanding of the HCP process is that the entity that is writing the HCP ultimately decides what goes in there. So it would be, the authors who decide what they want to submit as an HCP, and then the services then decide whether what has been submitted is adequate and whether they'll accept it or not. And so in order to avoid a lot of, that iterative process being too long, often the services get involved early on to say, yeah, you're on track to meet what we think, or, we see a little concern here, you might want to consider this. But, even if they emphatically say, this isn't what we think, if the authors want to submit what they want to submit, that's their prerogative. It just might not be accepted by the services.
That's good clarification. I think that's spot on. Jennifer?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Julie said. It's really up to us to propose what's in the HCP, and then the services will respond. Stacy, you had already made my point I was going to make earlier, which is that some of the question about the metrics and getting into the weeds, some of that just has to be kicked to IRST, because some of the biological goals and objectives, we have major knowledge gaps, and IRST will help frame up, what those metrics might look like that we're going to measure, and what the threshold or trends that we're looking for might be. And then, yeah, I guess before my kind of parting thoughts is, as you guys engage on the conversation, I think what Terry said is exactly right. I mean, the question here is, when does this group want to take on the effectiveness monitoring plan as a whole? Even though it was not identified as one of the 3 priorities in rule, when you look at the way the rule is written, it's clear that effectiveness monitoring in general is a priority. And so I think it is important that thought be put into how it's going to be accomplished over, the 50-year term. And then I would encourage you not to get too hung up into the weeds on what metric and what threshold. That's going to be developed, by the department and the authors and the HCP, informed by this group and IRST over time. This is a 50-year HCP, and so some of our metrics also are going to evolve over time. So keeping like the amphibians, for example, we have huge knowledge gaps, and so the HCP will be hopefully approved and running. We'll be up and running while we're still figuring out some of these metrics and what needs to be measured for amphibians. So just remember that this is a long-term project as you engage in conversation and fleshing this out. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Wendy?
Yeah, so still kind of getting up to speed about the overlap of all this. To me, when I first had this question about whether this committee would be working on the effectiveness monitoring, I was thinking, why not? Because it says in the description of the adaptive management program that it has to do that. And then when we look at the part on this specific committee, it doesn't include that. So maybe there's a little disconnect there. But if we didn't do it, who would do it? It seems to me that because it's an aspect of the program that the rules say have to be done, that someone needs to do it. And it seems like this committee is the likely suspect. So I mentioned that just in terms of trying to express my own sort of way I'm getting oriented about the various roles here.
Amanda?
Okay, I think we bludgeoned the first question that I had, a set of questions. My second question, kind of getting back to this, the question to the AMPC, is right now at ODF, we have staff, we have FTE associated with the compliance monitoring, and other parts of sort of monitoring across the department's efforts. For this effectiveness monitoring, one, is that going to be done internal? Are we going to be developing a new program at ODF with new FTE? Is that being done through contractors, that are managed by contracts through the IRST? And in both of those cases, you know, to me, it gets back to funding as well. So is the effectiveness monitoring gonna take funding associated with our other three priorities on an annual basis, you know, whenever we're doing monitoring, or if it's outside of that structure and we do develop a new part of forest resources and we have a program with a new manager that is managing an effectiveness monitoring for this, you know, how is that funded or what are we thinking about? So just getting to kind of the structure of how we are gonna make a decision and how that fits in with our other priorities. I don't know if we have those answers or if anybody has any thing to enlighten us, but I think that, you know, that's an important piece. If we think that.
Go ahead, real quick. This is coming up a lot in this particular question is coming up a lot in the TMDL. Because ODF says, we don't have resources, in all honesty, we don't have resources to do TMDL implementation effectiveness monitoring. So how do we do this? And so that question is coming up in other arenas. And so, you know, and so then the question is, well, if it's DEQ TMDL, you know, the question that I've heard from ODF, and I'm jumping in from getting this wrong or throwing a pen at me. It's so like, you know, shouldn't you be doing that, monitoring, you know, that data and then ODF about effectiveness? And, you know, it's a fair question. I don't have the answer for it. You know, so if we need to do effectiveness, and some of that is on water quality and some of that is on habitat structure. Well, we have a water quality agency, DEQ, we have a habitat agency, ODFW. So is there things that DEQ and ODFW are already doing? Or could like add on to their existing monitoring programs, for example, that would then give us that information for status and trends. So that's what I was talking about. So I can't say like the answer to that is yes, but I think it's just something for us to consider. On the water quality side, is there something that DEQ should be adding to their programs or bringing forward? And on the habitat structure and function side, and fish passage side, is there something that ODFW has in their existing programs that can be rather than trying to like squeeze more out of ODF and out of the adaptive management program, but now it's already got a few, you know, heavy questions to handle at this point.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, and maybe it's just a plus up of the adaptive management program or somebody that, yeah, we have these other data sources, but somebody's gonna have to do reporting, like somebody has to take that on, and I don't know that there's a lot of extra capacity right now to do that.
Yeah,
I don't wanna speak to ODS capacity, but.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Josh is right, there's the limit, that would figure out how to build capacity and resources is gonna take. So, yeah, I mean, right now, we can squeeze out UFPE to spend 3 years from now, you know, if we plan, then that's always a possibility. I guess when we initially had this conversation, I was assuming it would go through Earth and then or contracted. So that would be door number 2.
And doing all those.
Which to me then is like, is it a research question, right? And there's like a research.
Well, I think there is a research question component to it. I think it's all of the above, right? I mean, I think the first question is figuring out what are we actually trying to monitor? Like that's the question for, you know, that's one of the iteratives of the question for the IRSD. And then once you figure that out, what other monitoring programs are out there that are currently monitoring things like this or in that arena? ODF and W, DEQ, as you mentioned, and is there nexus there where it would make sense to do something there? And then where there's not, or where there's maybe it doesn't make sense, or there isn't somebody monitoring, then it's AMC dollars funding probably long-term, you know, monitoring project through, you know, but all of that I think is down the road as we sort of develop that it's pieces of the overall program that, you know, right now, we're not perfectly clear to all of us. So you're all asking all of these questions, they're fantastic questions. But you're all just basically highlighting, these are the areas that we need to start working on. And it starts with sort of a broader, you know, vision, and then getting into the weeds on every individual piece of it to try to figure out how we put all this together. And I think if you fast forward, you know, going back to what Kyle said at the beginning of the meeting, if you fast forward 10 years from now, I think it'll be fascinating to look at what has developed over this time frame with this group that's now starting here and now. You know, and people will look at it at that point, 10, 20 years from now and say, wow, look at all this stuff that's down. Oh, they should have thought about it this way or that way or whatever, you know? And at that point, it'll look like an entire program that's been delivered, but you know, it was this thing that we all came together to try to figure out how do we do. And there will be places that we, you know, improve over time and maybe we start with a contract, but then it shifts to a program where FTEs are generated, you know, I don't know, but there's a lot to it. And we just, you know, need to start the ball rolling. We don't have to solve it all at the beginning. Go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I think that's kind of where I'm at in terms of this discussion. I mean, we're not obviously gonna solve it today. And then I also think about where does the status and trend sort of process start and how does that get integrated in the strategy? Because some of those things, like you said, even if we started something now, we don't have the full plan or where things are gonna be funded, who's gonna do it. I mean, those are all like important questions to ask, but you can get something started in terms of like, what are some of the long-term trends? Even to be able to do that now in 10 years, when you're trying to figure out what are those specific questions, you have at least some data. So that's, I think important for the committee to consider as you kind of start on this journey is like, what are those things that we can kind of put in place? And then, you know, I won't speak for Adam's capacity at the moment, but some of those things like we can do, I think we can do like internally with, you know, some site setup and some conversation with DEQ and ODFW around, you know, site selection, those sorts of things. So, you know, just kind of throw that out there as the initial piece in the set of initial pieces that kind of start the effectiveness monitoring program.
And I do know that members of the IRST are chomping at the bit to also help us weigh into this. Like there's individuals that have a lot of thoughts on this. Some that are, you know, you got like Jeff and Kelly who are in the midst of this conversation with MASCP drafting piece, and they're working together closely. And they have a lot of thoughts that are developed along these lines that they would love to work with their own committee and then come back to us with those thoughts. So we don't have to do it ourselves within this committee. I think the IRT is going to be a big help on that. Did I see Wendy, or is it, I guess it was just Amanda as I was seeing peripherally.
Yeah, just one kind of last comment, just to put it on the radar, you know, since we are a policy committee at the end of the day. I mean, I can't speak for anyone other than myself, but, you know, it really would have been nice if we could have put a pop in around this and around, you know, maybe the ask for one extra FTE or a little bit of extra capacity. And just maybe a marker down that, you know, right now, our best option is probably going through IRST as far as what that looks like for the next few years, the next biennium, but then, you know, there might be another discussion that we have to have much sooner, given at least the current iteration of the process with the governor's office. So just to put a marker down, thinking about that. So I want to make sure ODF has the resources necessary to deliver on the promises. Granted, we get an ITP.
Casey.
Yeah, sorry, apparently I brought a sugar yet with me. I'm sure it's just mine. So along those lines, because I think it's a really good reminder of like what our role is here. Is that one as opposed to IRC. Helpfully, I think on the beginning of the document, that's the draft biological goals and objectives that was shared with us. There's a reminder that the roles and responsibilities of the IRST include bullet point number, whatever, 7, which is prepare reports for the Board of Forestry detailing effectiveness monitoring. And that, to me, that suggests that we're having a conversation that's really is clarifying as opposed to like making a new decision. Like, because I think that our job here today is to really clarify that this is the AMP, the debt management program will be doing, which is effectiveness monitoring, and what it looks like is, all of those questions. But that I think to Amanda's point is that maybe more funding will be valuable to go, whether it goes to a contract or an FTE at the agency, but that it clearly is that the mandate as part of asking these research questions is what's happening now, and then why is the research question, and what's going to change or what should change. But I at least have been very helpful to me in listening to all of you smart people talk about this. And you're right that they're probably, as I've heard the funding conversations, it's like, oh, it's because, we're going to RST and AMC will do this and this and this. But if there's another component on it, it probably does need to do more. There probably does need to be more funding. But I think listening to the conversations about different agencies that are already doing data collection, the person who's doing the monitoring is really pulling together all those different data sources and determining, one last thing is determining whether those measurements identify signals within the control of forest landowners. That's the language before the preamble to the biological goals and objectives. So I think it's really important for us to not be led down a path of we're looking at a data logger on the temperature that's downstream of federal forest. Or that, that we're making sure that we're collecting or looking at compiling and reporting back on data that is within the control of OFPA eligible or whatever regulated landowners. Okay, that's it for me. Sorry.
Yeah. Dave.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, what you're saying is there's going to be not just data aggregation, but curation, interpretation, contextualization.
Yeah.
Really a skillful treatment of the data that exists, as well as potentially gathering new data.
Right. And to that end, I sent it while I was listening to everybody, I sent just a proposed motion, I guess it would be, or I guess we're hoping to establish this and move the process forward, right? As opposed to just saying, it exists as part of what EMP does. So I sent Terry some language, but it's really basic. It's, the AMP will establish an effectiveness monitoring program, that EMP will identify environmental and operational measures that are directly related to BGOs. EMP will measure and make available to the public the BGO EM measurements. And the EM provides the basis for those research questions that justify changes of work practices. Does that?
What's an EM?
Oh, just effectiveness monitoring, sorry.
Did you say AMP or AMPC?
And I can, Harry has it, so he can put it up on a screen if he wants to.
And I know
I was just thinking collect this into one, sure, we're agreeing to this, but, all right. So.
Yeah, I know Terry had worked on putting together a draft as
great.
well.
So glad, ignore me then, Terry.
David, you've got the, you want to pull up the draft motion that's a straw person to.
Actually, could you pull it up, Terry? It would require me digging through my inbox.
Gotcha.
In public.
Yeah, let me, as my computer kicked off, it'll take me 15 seconds here to pull it up.
To kind of summarize where we are thinking about the goal for this is to make sure we're all on the same page, that this is a shared priority, that there are some differences where it's not quite a clear research question. It should be core to our priorities, and then we're going to start really moving forward with figuring out the plan and how we work with IRST some really great questions raised here about what is existing resources we have, resources that are doing monitoring at different agencies, how can we expand on that? Understanding, you know, as the HCP itself moves forward in parallel to this process, we'll get more clarity there about the metrics and thresholds. So just to kind of summarize a little bit, I think where we are, and then Perry put together a draft motion for us.
So, and we talked about this, yeah, thanks, Stacy. We talked about this just briefly prior to the meeting. Barry, Stacy, and myself, and the idea here would be just to, once again, just publicly acknowledge as an AMC that this is a priority of the AMC, that we're going to work on this. And then kick off a work group, which we've used before. So let the public know that we are creating a work group to help inform the initial development of a strategy around monitoring. So, and then of course we would identify the folks that are interested in and have time to participate in that work group, and then we'll prioritize that along with the other priorities we have and try to move each one along and make progress on them throughout the meetings over the next several months.
Just do a quick question.
Yeah.
Do you think this, Casey, I'm wondering whether this is helpful to Jennifer to integrate into, I think it's chapter 6, or whether that's something that we should talk about later. Chapter 6 of the HCP around adaptive management, effectiveness monitoring.
You mean the language?
Yeah, that language, just like, this is, you know, here's some placeholder language for them.
Is Jennifer, are you still on? I can't see everyone.
Sorry, yeah, I stepped away for a moment, but I'm back.
Did you hear Casey's question?
He's asking whether we could put this language from the motion in the HCP.
Or whether that would be helpful to you.
Whether this language is helpful for you. Should be.
I mean, yeah, we could put it in chapter 6 as just indicating that this work is to be, you know, to occur later. I don't know whether it's helpful or not to the services, but it would at least frame up that this has been initiated.
I think that was our thought.
Okay.
Stacy and I and Terry talked about it, and that was our hope, is that this would show, you know, earnest, that it's actually on the agenda, that it's going to be worked on as a priority over the coming months.
Yeah, we could put this in for the June draft, and at least indicates that, you know, the work will be determined. And then as the HCP develops, depending on, you know, progress, we can add detail as available, I would think.
Yeah, Stacy.
Yeah, just want to add a little color to what we were thinking about this work group, because I imagine probably everyone here wants to have input on this. Obviously, it's going to be a super long process, but we were envisioning this work group really kind of between now and our meeting in June, getting together. We've kind of thrown together some draft questions or rough scope of something that could go to IRST that would help inform these conversations. So I think we were envisioning that work group would really kind of start fleshing that out. And then the goal would be by the June meeting, we could have a more detailed conversation around kind of a plan or a set of questions that could go to IRST on this topic. Does that make sense, or did I just add more confusion?
My question is whether you,
Go ahead.
Whether you were saying that between now and June, we will be having some back and forth with IRST in terms of how they'd like to approach it, or if we're sort of teeing up that conversation with IRST.
I think it's the latter, it's the
Okay.
teeing up. So it'd be a work group to help look at and we had some back and forth over it's sort of a broad question to sort of kick to IRST, help us develop what this program looks like, right? But there's a little bit more detail to it than that. And so this work group that we're talking about would look at that language and give Terry some thoughts around refining that language, and then that would come back to us at the June meeting, this group. And then this group would hopefully try to get to a final stage of that initial question, which would be, again, a very broad sort of question to kickstart the IRST's involvement in this.
With the goal being, since we're not meeting monthly as we had been, and we've also got other things moving, taking advantage of a small group to kind of focus so that we've got something concrete, straw man draft to work around when we need it to.
And then whatever that, assuming we were able to get to an agreement on that language, that also would obviously be available for inclusion in the draft HCP language if useful. So, any questions around the draft motion that have not actually been made yet, but it's on the board? There. Jason, yeah, you haven't said much online, just checking in to make sure you're there and tracking, and give you opportunity if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I don't have any additional questions. Tracking everything well.
Awesome. Adam.
Quick question. Is there a process by which work groups are formed, or is that, I mean, how will that be established?
That's a good question, Adam, because we initially, we had some thought about maybe trying to formulate this work group before this meeting, even today. But it had occurred to us as we had this discussion, that when I say us, I mean Terry and Stacy and I, as we were planning for this meeting. It occurred to us that that would be out of step with how we've done it in the past, and we wanted to make sure that the public was being made aware that we were going to be making a work group that would, inform thoughts on this for Terry. And then B, that we would have that discussion with this group, and this group could weigh in whether you thought that was a good idea or not, and who might want to be on that work group. And so to answer your question, Adam, I don't know that we have a formalized way. In the past, the couple of work groups we've created, we've just sort of said it in a meeting, we'd like to create a work group, and everybody kind of more or less agreed that's a good idea to move this forward. And then we said, anybody willing to serve on that work group? And we tried to sort of make sure there was a healthy balance of agency and conservation and landowner type folks on the work group, and then made it happen, and that group met. That's the process we've done before, but I do think it's important to make sure that we do that in a public way so that it's not, being seen as something that's being created behind closed doors, and that we're somehow hand picking and excluding others. We want to make sure we're being open there. Amanda?
I just have a comment, and I don't know Adam wants to answer this, but obviously there's a relationship with ODF and Mount Hood Environmental through the compliance monitoring piece. Just thinking about that and thinking about IRST and their engagement, just trying to think about efficient ways of utilizing everyone's time and relationships. Does it make sense to I'm just trying to think of like what the role of IRST is compared to going directly to a contractor to develop like a statistically significant study design and methodology.
I think as it pertains to the work of the adaptive management program, our charge is to use the IRST. Now, if the IRST comes back to us and says, here's a component that, we would like some additional help or resources around, then I think that's certainly something, but I see that as the engagement. If somebody like a Mount Hood Environmental or any other, frankly, organization that does research or monitoring work, I think it's IRST's role to identify those and do sort of those requests for proposal. And it could be on stuff like, help us figure out this part of this or that part of this, and then they could decide that. But I think IRST is our group to for those questions.
Yeah, and I guess my thought here is that this is a separate process in many ways from our initial process of the research questions and the topics. And so as we think about the motion in front of us, it's really beholden to AMPC to do these things, right? That's what the motion says. In some ways, to me, I read that and it says, we are supposed to develop the strategy and then ask IRST for input or review. So would it be outside of the scope of this body to say, we want to work with a contractor to develop a good methodology for then IRST to work from or review and have them be really the subject matter experts to be able to provide that technical review that this body maybe can't to the recommendations or the strategy developed by like a Method Environmental or some other group. Again, recognizing we have limited money, we already have 3 fairly large priorities in front of IRST. How do we best utilize our time and our resources and the time and the resources of IRST to deliver on the priorities of this body? Because we don't really have a process for this type of thing.
I don't know that we have to get too wrapped up in I think at some point it is beholden upon us to manage our budget, right? And to have discussions about when we might not have enough, but ultimately, I think our primary job is around the what's the right word for this? The monitoring itself and the questions themselves. The dollars and cents about how things get done, frankly, there's actually more of a nexus there, or I don't know more, but we share that with IRST. It's also their duty to manage that through the contracts with the research. And I would hate for us to get too wrapped up in the dollars and cents that we don't develop the right program. If we get to a point where we're getting constrained, or when we get to that point, then that's where we have conversations about priorities and what's getting monitored and what's getting, when we do certain research. I don't know. I tend to think about it the other way around in terms of developing and I think this is what the authors had in mind in the adaptive management programming, was developing the right program and then figuring out the funding, not figuring out the funding and then developing a program. So I see some online hands. So let's go with Jason and then Julie.
Great, thank you, and I appreciate the question, Amanda. As I look at the way the motion is currently written, we're really looking at approving this as a priority and then really approving a process. And I think to Amanda's question, part of approving the process or working through a process for the strategy is really identifying some of these unmet needs, resource needs, funding needs, things like that. I think that's part of the strategy. So I see the motion as setting us moving forward to start the strategy. And then there's a lot of these conversations that the work group will have to work through in terms of what that strategy looks like. That includes not just moving forward with an end result. It's all the different pieces that are going to have to come into play as we put that strategy together.
Julie.
Yeah, I appreciate the question too. And I guess what I wanted to throw out there is that I think that we probably got the resources in the room to be able to put together a monitoring approach to send to IRST. I don't anticipate the need to send that out to a contractor, but if we did, I guess because I think that that's probably an unlikely occurrence, I'm content to say we'll figure it out when we get to that point.
Yeah, all right, so Stacy and then Adam.
Yeah, I just thought Adam raised this thingy earlier, clearly.
You wanna go first, Adam? Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think to your question, Amanda, first thing that comes to mind was Senate Bill 1501. I know that there's some language in there about if there's rule change and it's related to aquatic resources. I was just trying to find a language there that it's gotta happen through AMC. And how specifically the process after that, at that point, maybe Terry knows the exact language there, but it's just something to keep in mind when we're doing effectiveness monitoring that happens outside of AMC. It results in rule change, then we're basically breaking, so.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point.
All right, Stacy.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, so I went back to quick look at the rules again. And it is the adaptive management program, which is both AMC and IRST, that is supposed to conduct the effectiveness monitoring. So I wonder, because I think the point you raised is a good one. To me, it really lives under both, right? That's the umbrella. So maybe if it's helpful, you know, we can add at the end to develop the strategy as part of the adaptive management program, or somehow signal that it's not just AMC in the driver's seat, but you know, there is this interaction with IRST as well. I don't know if that addresses your concern. It does read a little more tip to AMC. Obviously, there's an iterative relationship.
He's changed in coordination with the IRST.
I think that's a little bit different than what Stacy said, but.
Will's got us.
Yeah.
Commissioner Tucker's got us.
It could be Will.
Yeah.
So to me, the concept of these measurements are so critical. I would almost ask that we make sure that we include, until I hear the references to previous documents or to legislation, that we include the agencies. We ask the services to actually really weigh in, really be a part of this, because we're in service of the agencies, and it's the goals of our biological goals and objectives, but they're in service of the best practices from, and then HCP has to be approved by those services. And so I would hope as we go through this, we're looking at these measurements as being high enough up in the air, big enough in scope, that they really are collecting a broader sense. We can't have 5,000 different objectives and measurements and try to check the effectiveness at each stream, but we need to have some way to aggregate those together. And I think the services will bring us that perspective. And so I don't know, because when I listened to you just now, Stacy and Adam, I hear concerns about maybe it is our responsibility and it is and I think it is, to me, why I wanted to be on this was, in fact, the whole management of effectiveness and evolution of what we do in practices around improving the effectiveness. So, but I really do think there's a role here. We should think about how we ask the services to engage.
Yeah, and I think that it's a good point. Adam, that was a legacy.
Yeah, but I do actually wanted to respond.
Go ahead.
So I don't know that there's concern. I guess I'm still like, in terms of like saying what we can commit to or what resources we have, I'm open to that discussion. So just kind of, yeah, I guess I wouldn't say it's a concern. It's just open discussion.
Amanda.
I don't know if this is like a little bit of brevity in the conversation, but I keep thinking, like, we're in tax season, right? And I just keep thinking about how, like, the IRS knows how much money I need to pay, and yet I have to do all the work about that number. And it's like similar where it's like the services know what they kind of want to approve.
Yeah.
And we're trying to come up with something. But my point is that I don't want, especially us as a volunteer entity, now some of us are, did get some money to participate. I don't want us to be spending a bunch of time and effort trying to put something together that isn't going to succeed, kind of to Will's point, right? And so how do we make sure that, and again, I'm not trying to say we need to be like nickeling and diming, but just trying to think about what that looks like and the work group. You know, I think that it's fine the way that it talks about the work group developing a process, right? And drafting a process to do that. We're not gonna solve that problem here today, right? That's not really the intent of this conversation. But I'm just thinking about the timeline, and if this has to be done by June, again,
It doesn't. No, you're misunderstanding, and that's probably my fault for miscommunicating. So we don't have to have all of this sussed out by June.
Okay.
What we have to have, we think it's sufficient, to have this, frankly, by June. And maybe if the work group can meet and come up with some general language that would then kick off the IRST's participation in this conversation, maybe we could have that done by June, in June sometime as well. That is not, what we're talking about here, this motion is not, and I can understand the confusion here, is not saying that this work group is gonna come up with the strategy. What it's saying, what we're trying to communicate with this motion is that the work group would be coming up with the language to start IRST's participation in developing the strategy. So it would be language such as something like, we have a question we're kicking to the IRST is, how do we effectively develop a monitoring strategy for these biological goals and objectives? What ones do we have a good sense of right now, and what ones do we not, and how do we wrap our arms around that? I mean, that's the type of question that we would be developing by June, right? It would not be a complete strategy. It would just be a help us kickstart this conversation, which would then snowball into a lot of additional back and forth and getting into each one of these avenues of these biological goals and objectives to then figure out how much, literature, do we need literature reviews here? Do we need systematic evidence reviews to determine this or that? Some of them, do we just need to, maybe we have our arms wrapped around it. We just need to work with ODF and W who's monitoring something already. We can maybe talk about adding in some piece of it. Anyway, there's a bunch of pieces to this, but that would be all we would expect that work group to work on between now and June. And then that would develop into eventually a more comprehensive strategy. And to answer the question about, or to address a little bit about, I totally agree with you all. We don't want to deliver something to the federal services that's going to be rejected. The authors have no desire to do that. And I don't anticipate that's going to happen. The authors are going to develop what they're already developing. I think is going to be very solid. They have worked with, and the department has worked with the federal services throughout the process. That will happen even more closely after the draft is given to them with some back and forth. I don't think it's our job within AMC to make sure that HCP is solid. That is the authors and the department's job. And so I think we don't have to worry about that. I would put those concerns aside. It's not the job of this group. And I'm confident that the work group that is working on that will be able to achieve it. If not, then all of this disappears by 2027, and nobody wants to see that happen. So, so with that in mind, putting that sort of hopefully assuaging your concerns there, I think we will kickstart this. There will be more to come once the biological goals and objectives are a little bit more sussed out and some of the drafting is done. That will then inform. In the meantime, we'll work on what's the right language to kickstart IRST's work. There'll be a bunch of back and forth there. This is not going to be solved in the next month or 3 months or 5 months. It's just going to start.
Okay, so just to follow up, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah. It's like slightly related.
Okay, so, I'm looking at our 2024 AMPC roadmap, the agenda, the finalized research agenda by December 9th. So the goal would be that we have something based on this in our research agenda that goes to IRST by December 9th. Thinking about the 4 to 5 day period and just working back from there. So for that question, and then like, when does the strategy have to be developed as required within the EIS framework? Right, like what?
Ultimately, we don't have to start. All of what we are proposing within that HCP doesn't, I mean, this is probably putting it a little bit too simplistically. But typically you would apply for an HCP and then start doing the work that you're doing under the HCP. And not until it's approved, would you be required to be putting those practices on.
But they have to approve the methodology for our effectiveness monitoring is what it seems like that's said earlier today.
I don't think they will be
They have to
approving.
agree that what we're doing
They
is
have to
gonna
agree.
meet the ITP.
But, well, I'll step back again what I said in the beginning. No other HCP other than the one in Washington under the forest practice rules has this level of scrutiny and detail. It is not a requirement of an HCP to have this level of involvement in adaptive management. And so we are already way above and beyond the standard HCP. And so I don't think the federal services are going to necessarily want to weigh in on every detail of adaptive management. In fact, they've kind of already told us that. So I think more or less what we're proposing, what we're going to provide for them in the HCP is, again, like I said, them buying into the process itself. We have a process for managing adaptive management, and it's a very detailed process. And some of it we can spell out more than others, but it's going to happen and be delivered, and they'll be able to participate in it over time. That's why they have a seat on the.
If you're just gonna comment on that, I don't know how many times Kim has actually been here. How many persons actually sat at these meetings, which is a bit frustrating to me. About the actual participation. And I'm glad Sam's here. Thank you, Sam, for being here, but at some point, we do need to have that participation and that engagement. And in the same way, the question that you posed, Seth, is like, oh, this could be a potential question to the IRST. Well, where do the authors fit in there? At some point, there has to be a communication between what they're doing and how we're developing a strategy to do what they want. So I'm just a little bit confused about how this process moves forward. And the work group is gonna be having a communication with the authors group in order to better understand what the end goal is. I'm just still really confused about the process.
Yeah, that's a good question, but I think it reflects that this is all kind of happening at the same time, right? Don't have finalized BGO for us to look at and kind of know where we're going. I think on the timeline piece, there will be this state submits the HCP to the services in June, then there's this time for some input, then there's the public process. I don't imagine that we are developing this, we'll be doing it at the same time, right? That's happening. So there will be some interaction there, and that's good questions about sort of the relationship between the HCP directors and IRST and AMC. But I think as that moves forward, and that's part of the intention with this motion, is for essentially AMC to also signal like we are also on this track, starting to figure it out, identifying that this is a priority. We haven't really had this conversation yet as a committee, really focused on, it's come up here and there. Obviously, it's underlying a lot of our conversations, but the intention is really to show that we're making this a priority. The committee is going to be working on it. We're not going to have it all figured out. We acknowledge that the HCP is being drafted as we speak. So maybe the way the motion is written is a little more ambitious than really what we were proposing, which was just to signal that this is a priority for the committee. And we're going to make some progress with this small work group to kind of figure out, you know, some of the core questions that we had just kicked around are really high level, right? Like what are the VGOs, or there's enough science to develop metrics for? Well, we don't know the details of those VGOs yet, but when we get to that point and IRSD can look at that, then they'll be able to really dig into those. So kind of stacking things. I don't know if that is any clearer on the process side, but there's a lot of moving pieces, I guess.
Yeah, Casey.
Yeah, we get confused all the time.
It's your hairstyle.
I'm married to Katie, so. I just wanted to highlight, because it is highlighted or it's yellowed, I guess we can call it highlighted. I don't think that and research should be in there, because we're doing an effectiveness monitoring strategy, and I don't want to confuse it with any other part of the research agenda or research questions. And I thought, Seth, when I was like, why is this in here? Then you laid out a really good explanation of how the process goes forward. And it really didn't include, like, I was so like, well, but it's an effectiveness monitoring strategy and not an effective monitoring. It may require IRS to do some research, I don't know. And so I just wanted to make a case for removing that so that there's not confusion.
I think that's fair. I think that's I don't know.
But thank you for helping me understand a little bit more of it too. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's better. Thank you. Well,
So I'm wondering if with that change, are we ready to move this forward? Because to me, this is really a strong signal we want to send, and I think it is time for us to put it forward.
you making a motion?
I move that we adopt the motion 1, which says the Adaptive Management Program Committee. Oh, are we not ready? No, I'm okay. Second. Improves the including development of the effectiveness monitoring strategy among its priorities for 2024. The MC work group will initiate drafting requests for help from the IRST in developing the strategy.
Can we have a second?
I'm very happy to make that.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, it's critical.
Any discussion of the motion? Josh?
Yeah, I think this is a really, a good thing for the adaptive management program to do, to start looking at effectiveness monitoring. So we're gonna rely on these VGOs and their metrics, and we need to measure. And I also think for, other, this is ODF has to implement the incidental pig permit. But this will also, I think, help with other programs where ODF or DEQ or the lead agencies for the state, like TMDLs, like I mentioned, and then on the coastal zone, not quite control plan, that is like the state of Oregon's plan, DEQ and conservation and development have to pull it all together. But, forestry has a critically important role in that as well. So I'm really supportive of this, because I think it's gonna help, not just with the HCP, but have positive repercussions throughout parts of state government or state government programs that where forestry is part.
Excellent. Thank you. Amanda?
My only question with the motion is defining what among its priorities means. We've never used like that specific language before. And so that's where I'm getting a little confused with, we've got this date of December 9th, our research agenda. And we're not really gonna be making decisions about what's in our research agenda until we get back at, that scope of work. We do a proposal to the IRST, they give, there's this iterative process, right? And then we make a decision about the research agenda. So are we implying here that we're making a decision to include the strategy development within our research agenda now, or are we signaling that we are going to be working with the IRST in that first process of getting them, a statement of work? Like I guess I just want to be specific in what we're what the next step is and what we're thinking towards, and I feel like among its priorities is really unclear to me. And I will say, I mean, I am supportive of moving this direction, and I just want to make sure that we're all clear and on the same page.
I think the idea of using among its priorities, correct me if I'm wrong, Terry, was that we had initially we had a substantial decision of the AMC to approve 3 priorities. Adaptive or amphibians as a priority, just amphibians. And then Eastern Oregon slopes literature review and the roads package. I'm not saying that right, but basically the roads questions. Now what we're talking about, so those are the existing 3 priorities according to substantial decision of this committee. What we're talking about is adding a 4th, which is this effectiveness monitoring, developing an effectiveness monitoring strategy. And I think to answer your question about the December 9th, we need to talk more about that and certainly like I think figure out what, and that's part of this might be some of that back and forth with the IRST. What could we effectively develop in terms of a question that could be prioritized for further development by December 9th? And what are the pieces that need more work, right? So I think we'll know more about that as we move along in subsequent meetings and back and forth with the IRST. I don't know if Stacy, if you have anything else.
Yeah, I think we struggled with this a little bit, right? Because it is kind of its own thing. It is a core responsibility of this committee and the IRST to do this effectiveness monitoring. And we also have these 3 defined specific priorities. So it doesn't fall as neatly into that bucket. And therefore, I think there's some question about timing and where it falls. You know, like you were just saying, we may identify working with IRST question or 2 questions that fall into that list. But it's also much broader than that. And so I don't know that it falls as neatly into that timeline, but I guess that's a question that I have as well.
Yeah, and I guess just a follow-up, I think we called those priority research topics. That was the whole comment, how we talked about those were research topics. And so maybe a friendly amendment would be among its prioritized research topics for 2024. That fit in line with the language used for the other 3.
I think, if I may, Chair, I think that avoiding making more specifics on this. Well, a general, like a plain language version of the definition of priority is that we're going to make sure we do this at over and above perhaps other things in 2024. That's like a plain language reading of that. If we add words to it, then we start putting it into other processes, including this research questions process that we have a proposed. Yeah, we'll get to it. And I don't want to put this. I don't want to put effectiveness monitoring and our policy work on it into a research question, because I don't think it is. Because to your point, it's actually what underpins all of the information gathering that we'll be doing in order to do research questions. So my preference would be to leave it at a plain language, even though I recognize that you all were thinking about it in terms of research priorities. So that's my call for keeping it as is. But in the Robert's Rules of Order, it can be you could make a motion and we could vote on it too.
Striving for consensus, right? So,
Yeah.
I'd rather do a temperature check on where people are at before any additional motion is made. But yeah, so I mean, and I'm fine with that. The other thing around, it's among its priorities for 2024 in some ways makes it seem like we're going to try to get it done by the end of 2024. And if it's not that, and it is beyond that, maybe we even strip it back further, like Casey's saying, as far as plain language and, that we're gonna have it as priority to be included in our work plan or something.
That's a good point. We do have the 4/20/24.
Then do we not prioritize it in 2025?
You're right. Right, we could, so,
I'm sorry, I'm making it more complicated.
no,
than
no,
I
it's,
was-
you're making good points. Jason, let's go with Stacy and then Jason.
Yeah, I think the point you raised is a really good one. I mean, like, it is confusing. And I didn't have a great answer in the time between. I think there's a way to maybe rework that. But somehow to signal that this committee recognizes this as like one of their responsibilities or core authorities or something like that, that indicates like we acknowledge that and we're making active progress on it. So I agree, the research priority, research topic, I don't think it should be conflated in that same bucket. It's kind of underpinning all of that, so I'll keep thinking, see what they're talking.
Jason?
Yeah, just a procedural question, because we do have an official motion in a second. And so I think we have to go through the process of making that either official or not official to make an amendment, so.
So we could do a couple of things. One, I think we could make an amendment to the motion, or Will, you could withdraw the motion to work on it, and then we could work on it.
I think I actually heard the friendly amendment comment made, and I'd be happy to accept the friendly amendment, removing 4/20/24 from the motion.
Okay.
Yeah, so do we need to make a motion to that amendment? If I seconded, vote on the amendment?
Yep.
You have the amended motion on it.
Correct.
So I would move that, follow up on Amanda's suggestion that we remove 4/20/24 from the language of the motion.
Okay.
I'll say.
And you have a second. All right.
And then Wendy has a.
And then Wendy has a
I
card.
did have a comment, which was, I thought the motion as originally was fine, and now I say I think that motion is fine too.
All right, excellent. Oh, these are good. This is good, and I appreciate Terry taking a stab at getting some. When we said we forwarded this to Stacy and I think my response was, this is good enough to get us started, but I'm sure the committee would have to weigh in. So that's fine, and I think this is great.
I'm just gonna do just one real quick thought on it too, is I think that this is just fine without the 4/20/24. But going back to we're Steph and Stacy and I we're like back and forth on HCP stuff all the time, and so I raised this just to make sure that we're comfortable with it in the context of the HCP and what the services are requesting, which is to say, like, we would be having this conversation with Jennifer Weichel, if we were in the authors meeting, I think that it's sufficient right now to signal to the services, this is what we're gonna do if we plop this into chapter 6, the compliance, adaptive management. Yeah, I think it is, and I think it would be stronger if it said 4/20/24, just because it tells them that we're actively working on it. But honestly, we're gonna be actively working on it. So
yeah,
as long as everybody here, like, yeah, we're actively working on it, totally good with it. I'm getting a lot of nod.
Well, I do appreciate what you said at the beginning, Casey, which is whether or not this body adopts a motion like this, the fact remains that this is our job. Like it's maybe not written as well as it could be in the rules.
Yeah.
But it is definitely a job that this program is supposed to tackle. And so I think what this motion is doing is officially just saying we acknowledge that, and we're going to start working. Okay, we have a motion and a second on an amended motion. Is there any more discussion before we take a vote? All right, let's go ahead and take a vote. And Terry, do you want to call the roll?
Sure. Seth Barnes,
I vote aye.
David Bugney,
Yes.
Stacy Detweiler,
Aye.
Julie Furman,
On mute, Julie.
Aye.
Wendy Gerlach. I think you responded, I didn't hear it. Is that correct?
Aye.
Casey Kulla,
Aye.
Jason Robison,
Aye.
Josh Seeds, Amanda Sullivan Astor,
Aye.
and William Tucker.
Aye.
So that's 10 yes and 0 no. So the motion passes.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the good discussion. We'll have a lot more discussion on this topic.
Yeah, the amendment passed. The motion-
That was on the amendment. Now we have to pass. Okay.
Now.
Okay, now read it for the actual motion then, Terry.
So.
Go.
Yes. Contrary.
So motion has passed, reads the Adaptive Management Program Committee, AMPC, approves including development of the effectiveness monitoring strategy among its priorities. An AMPC work group will initiate drafting a request for help from the IRC in developing the strategy.
So Terry, I think the vote we just took was on the amendment of the original motion, taking out the 4/2024.
Correct.
So now we're gonna take a vote on this motion that's in front of us. It's
Okay.
also proposed and seconded.
Okay.
So go ahead and read it. Read the
Yes.
roll.
Seth Barnes,
Yes?
Dave Bugney,
Yes.
Stacy Detweiler,
Yes.
Julie Furman,
Yes.
Wendy Gerlach,
Yes.
Kim Pratt, oh no, I'm sorry, Casey Kulla,
Yes.
Jason Robison,
Yes.
Josh Seeds,
Yes.
Amanda Sullivan Astor,
Aye.
William Tucker.
Aye.
Okay, so the motion passes 10-0 as read.
All right, thank you again. Like I said, we'll have a lot more to talk about on this one. I appreciate getting the ball rolling and all of the good discussion, great questions and things to think about moving forward. So Terry, where are we at on the agenda?
Well, I think it's time for a break. You might want to, at the end of, after the break, bring up this question of requesting a specific work group on that. Before.
Cool. Good point. Yep, good point. Thanks for.
Before.
So let's have a break. Let's take a break. What is it? Where's the official clock in here? 11:22, according to the clock in here. So I'll be back by 11:30. Too much time, not enough time. I think that's good. 11:30.
27.
Minutes of surgery.
Too bad it's funny.
Yeah.
And just a reminder to.
Yep. Recording started. Go ahead and start back up, Seth, or let me know if you want me to do it. Read it.
No, well, I can get us started. So thanks, everyone, and we're back. So the next point of order related to the last one is just the creation of that work group. And and again, realizing that this is just like this work group is likely going to change over time as well. So this work group that we're talking about is a work group to meet once or twice or how, 2 or 3 times, whatever it happens to be, a few times between now and June to help inform Terry on a draft question that would be put before this group to help kickstart the IRST's involvement in the adaptive management, in the monitoring, effectiveness monitoring strategy conversation. So if you aren't, that's all to say, if you aren't participating in this initial group, doesn't mean that you won't have other opportunities to participate down the road. And this also doesn't mean if you get put on this group that you're going to be the person on this work group for the duration of time, right? So yeah. So with that in mind, are there thoughts, people that really want to be involved and have the time to be involved in the next couple of months on this work group?
Yeah, I feel like maybe I should jump in since I'm the person that raised the question of effectiveness monitoring last year as a research topic.
Okay.
Great, made some noise about it, so maybe I know that you'll see a little bit of additional work on it since I've been expressing interest in this for the duration.
Sure.
I'll pitch in.
Excellent. So we got Josh. Thank you. And again, we can't have too many because we don't want to have a quorum here as well. Wendy?
The only problem is I'm on vacation like June 8th. It means it might not be ideal, but it most of the work. I think our meeting is on the 24th of June.
I think the work would probably primarily be before that, is my guess. So if you're willing to serve, I think that would be great to have you there, Wendy. Are you two going to be on it or? That's a good question.
They have like, especially in the next few months, have a lot of work. I just wanna acknowledge, like lobbying, that's an understatement.
Yeah, I would prefer, and that I not, and Stacy probably feels similar, just because of the workload with the HCP work that's facing us, but with that in mind, from the working force side, landowner side, David or Amanda, would either one of you be willing, interested?
I can help out, did you have a sick child?
Yeah, well, and I'm just thinking about everything I'm gonna have to get done before I maternity leave, so.
Okay, so Dave,
Congratulations.
that'd be great. Yeah. An official announcement.
I feel like
Amanda is pregnant. So now.
I'm 24 weeks pregnant, so I'll figure out the way. Yes, so I will have lots to do.
Okay, so Dave volunteered, that's fantastic. So we have Dave, Wendy, and Josh, and I think we can have up to how many people serving on a work group, Terry? Remind me what that number is. Is it?
Right, it needs to be below quorum, which is 6 of 10.
So we can
So,
have up to 5.
yeah, probably
3. We don't have to have 5 if,
It's 4 in one of our previous.
yeah, I think that's fine.
And I'm happy to be involved, but I think that maybe on conservation side is also.
Yeah. Either way works for me. If you want to jump on instead of me. Happy to.
Okay, well, let's, Jason or I don't know if Julie, we've got one agency, so Josh, so we're probably good for agency.
I would love to be involved, but I want to be on, my time the next 2 months is limited, very limited. And so I wouldn't be able to participate the way that I think it needs to be. So, but I am very interested.
Understood. And this will be a
So-
discussion item. Nothing's gonna move forward without the rest of the AMC weighing in.
This should be a work product.
Yeah.
This is
Julie?
for the monitoring, the group to talk about effective monitoring. You can count me
Yeah.
in.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's probably a good group. Casey, I know you're involved in HCP stuff as well.
Yeah, but I'm happy to just like be on, like essentially like on call if people want to run ideas past.
Fair enough. So let's
Mike,
count.
Josh have thought about it a lot, but this is something that we're gonna come back to.
Yep, just with the only thing I would caution there is that we don't do too many like that, because then it turns into serial Yeah, right. And so
Yep.
we want to keep that pretty tight there. Okay, so with that in mind, I think that's a good, so we got Josh, Dave, Wendy, and Julie. Let's count on those folks, and then Terry can reach out to you guys and help coordinate a time to kickstart that conversation.
Sounds good. Will do. Okay. I mean, I think we're ready to move on to the next topic, right?
Yes.
Great. And so really it's there's a bunch of questions from the IRST, clarifying questions from the IRST regarding the roads package. And but before you start to tackle that, just to note that their letter said that their intention that they'll be developing the scoping proposal on the roads package by December 31st, 2024. Assuming this is the first time they're doing it. So it's assuming there's no major roadblocks along the way because they're still figuring out the process, combined with they're going to need some timely input and feedback from the AMPC regarding these clarifying questions and then honing the actual research questions. So that's sort of the context. Before we start to look at the actual questions from the IRST, is there anything about that timeline from the IRST? Okay. So, Dave, do you want to pull it up or should I pull it up?
I can pull it up. Yep.
Okay, cool. And I guess I'll turn to Sean to see, as Dave is pulling it up. Sean, do you have any thing to add at this stage of the game, either about that timeline or about this set of clarifying questions from the IRST? Sean Gordon with INR.
Yeah, hi folks. Well, the timeline obviously is, we wanted to be fairly conservative here. As Terry says, this is our first time going through the process. We'll probably need some more feedback along the way. And the roads question is, the roads package is a pretty complicated and potentially expensive undertaking. So it could take quite a bit of time to work this out. Also, in our last IRST meeting, we met with some folks from compliance monitoring and the FRIA, the Forest Roads Inventory and Analysis process, that are both kind of just getting started up. And there may be, sorry,
Sean, just sorry to interrupt. I'm just trying to follow along. I think what's on the board, I don't want to confuse people.
Sorry, do I have the wrong?
Oh,
thing
yeah.
up?
Yeah, the wrong thing up, and I don't want people to be trying to decipher what that says while you're talking.
Thank you.
Getting,
Thank you.
yeah, sorry, go ahead, Sean.
Yep, thank you.
yeah, so I was just saying we met with the compliance monitoring and the FRIA coordinator, and I think there may be some real synergies there, kind of similar to what you folks have been discussing with different agency monitoring programs going on. So we hope that, it'll take some time to fit those together and see how those evolve. But we're hoping there'll be some synergies there, and maybe things can, we'll move forward as fast as we can on the process, but the timeline, we did want to be conservative on that to start out with.
David, we are still seeing the research questions process. I don't know if you've been able to.
Thank you. We'll get there, right?
We could see.
Yeah, thanks. You
There
see
we
it
are.
better now, Terry. Thank you.
Yep. Yep. So if you want to scroll down to the part where their questions actually start. There we are. Yeah. Oh, actually not this version is not the best because that has my draft responses. Were kind of my
Gotcha.
thinking.
Gotcha.
No,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
We can
Yeah,
see
Paul,
Terry's
sure.
brain.
Yeah, no, I'm seeing Terry's brain. Yeah, I'll just pull it here. I have the clean one here.
I don't think yours is dirty, Terry.
no, it's not. It's just is my thinking and haven't. There we are. Okay.
Slowly but surely, we got here.
Okay. So really, Seth, I think maybe I'll hand it back to you in terms of how you want to lead the group through this, but I can also, hopefully folks have had a chance to look at the different questions from the questions and comments from the IRST. But
So two things, so one sort of before we delve into the details, the questions before us, just so you all know some of the back and forth in the conversation that happened when we received these questions. One of the first questions that I think Stacy and I had was, how does this fit into the process? This sort of iterative questions back to us from the IRST. I think it is fair to say that it's not outlined in the process. But it's also, we kind of invited it in, Terry reminded us that we kind of invited it in our document that we had sent them. We said, we told them, if you have questions for us, let us know, or something like that. And so then that's when they brought these questions forward. I think the other important component here was also a question, okay, so how did these questions get developed? Were these questions developed and approved as, like, was this a package of questions that the IRST themselves developed and brought to us, or are these individual questions from individual IRST members back to AMC? And I think it's more of the latter. I think this was more of, my understanding is, and maybe Sean, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but that there was a synthesis of the questions that happened, but the discussion amongst the group at their public meeting did not result in these questions in a sort of a comprehensive way. In other words, these are more of individual questions from individual IRST members back to AMC. And so then we had a short discussion as chairs, as co-chairs with Perry about how this should happen in the future. And I think it's so we're now trying to address these as an AMC and not as individual AMC members, which I think is the right way to go here, and do it in a public way. But I think in the future, what we would recommend and is that the IRST in developing questions, develop them in a comprehensive way as a group before forwarding them to us, realizing that takes time, and that is, but that step in the process helps I think, hone down and synthesize what the actual questions are, and then also does it in a public way that people get a chance to weigh into, members of the IRST and then public if they have any thoughts on it, and then we respond in kind and as a public body. So I just wanted to put that on the record before we get into realizing that we're, again, like we've done all along, building the ship as we're sailing in it here. And so it's fine. We're going to do our best with this process as it was, and we're going to try to answer these questions and move forward. But I wanted to recognize, because we recognized it, that there's a little bit of a slight jankiness here that hopefully can be improved as we go down the road. And I don't know, Terry or Sean or Stacy, if you have thoughts there before we dig into the questions.
Yeah, I think you covered it, Seth. That was just, and sort of trying to anticipate this in the future. We're thinking about the precedent, and it was a little confusing, kind of getting this big list of questions, and there was a little bit more sort of coming from IRST as a approved, sort of, they've all looked at it, and these are the questions they've got. Maybe that kind of streamlines, simplifies the process a little bit, and signals like these the priority questions that they have, so we can respond as a committee to them.
All right, so with that on the record, let's go ahead and look at the questions themselves. What are the baseline levels of hydrologic connectivity of roads prior to the implementation of the Oregon Forest Practice Act road rules and effective Jan 1 of 2024? So the first question, the first field sampling of roads will likely not occur for several years after the PFA road rules become effective. There may be ways to identify and account for road segments that were updated per the rules before first sampling, but if not, is the AMC satisfied with the first sampling results? May best be useful for a baseline status evaluation against which future trends will be measured. Note that the first visit by Dubé et al. Referenced in the report in rules 2010 occurred 5 to 7 years after rule implementation, and no effort was used to account for updates between implementation and the first sampling. So we did have that discussion as a group. So thoughts around that. Terry, what was your draft response that you were thinking for that one?
I think it was essentially the AMC is aware of that limitation and acknowledges it and
do your best.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything more to add there? Okay.
I was just gonna, I didn't put my thing out, so.
That's okay, we can.
Mostly I was just thinking that, for the purposes of moving forward with good science, the 5 to 7 years with no, like, hey, were there any updates to the rules for us initiating this more quickly? I think is a really great way to actually capture earlier those improvements to the road infrastructure. So to me, it's going to be a better indication of how the roads are really doing as opposed to like a baseline that's later.
We will do better than Dubé.
Yes.
It's so close. Okay, so in point of order, as we're sort of talking about this, Terry, should we have a draft response up there that we can then, as a group, sort of just measure everybody seems okay with this response?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a good idea. I'm not sure we'll get through the entire document today, but even if you could get a first batch of responses approved, that would be great to help the IRST move on. And then I guess the question is, do you want to look at the document with my first guesstimate of what I understood, or would you rather kind of create from scratch like this?
I would rather build upon what your thoughts were. I think that we could, you've spent time coming up with that, and I think it would be helpful to use that as a starting point.
Yeah.
So anything additional to that? AMC recognizes this limitation and accepts that it is part of this situation. I mean, it kind of just says what it is. It basically kind of told them do your best. So, okay, all right, number 2. Oh, Amanda's got her card up. Go ahead.
I guess my answer to the, is AMPC satisfied? My answer would be no. I think there's gonna be plenty of road segments out there that haven't received a FRIA treatment or a, IRA treatment on small landowner, so I would not accept kind of the recommendation that they have there. I think that there's plenty of ways to include in a methodology to have alternative sites, alternative points, alternative segments within the selected population. And then if, a no app has been done on one that was selected and the activity has occurred, that gets thrown out and incorporated into the results and it just gets incorporated, right? And they use an alternative site until they have enough of a population to satisfy statistics. I mean, I think that we can do that at this point in the game.
It does seem like you could. I mean, there's so many sites out there. So many road segments out there, depending on how they start this. It seems like the baseline that and I tend to agree with you that they should be trying to look for ones that don't have work that has occurred on it as the baseline.
I think that is not of this question of the research that we're doing. So again, I would not be satisfied. I mean, if the research shows that what we were doing before was relatively good and that we had good hydrologic disconnection, like that's good for us to know. Or, that it was bad and in future monitoring efforts, right, that the trend is improving, that's what we're looking for. But if we're basing our baseline off of data that conflates both segments that haven't had work on them and segments that have following the rule implementation, I think that significantly muddies the water for the baseline.
We talking about effectiveness monitoring?
Josh.
Yeah, I think, it says in the credit deck comments from various teams, there may be ways to identify the account for the mistakes. So I like the first sentence there, which is kind of the only sentence. I think there should be a second sentence, which is because I agree with him. As much as is possible, to provide segments that have been updated, through the FRIA process or the small landowner process to be. I don't want the whole thing to shut down if they can't come up with a solid way to account for that, or they just gonna have to be some place in difference. Looking at polar segment or work done on part of it or something like this. I don't want to run into where this where it can't be done because we're being too stringent. But on the other hand, policies. The full work that's been desired that as much as is possible.
So David added a sentence there.
Took a stab.
Where possible, the AMC would like changes following PFA implementation to be accounted for. I think I would add something along the lines of maybe it's at the beginning. Where possible, the AMC would encourage road segments that have not been worked on and where not possible that changes following the PFA would be accounted for. Something like that. I mean, I would like to see IRST wrestle with this a little bit and figure out whether they can figure out a baseline that would be truly, work being done. And if there's not a good way to do that, and or their process of selecting segments comes back with, like you're saying, Josh, some that have pieces of work that have occurred, that they figure out a way to account for that where possible.
I just want to make sure it's not inflated.
It doesn't seem like an
You just
issue.
want to know which it is, yeah.
Yeah. It's fine if they collect information on it, but is that truly a baseline It's my question.
Yeah, I think it's two-part, right? It's one, it discounts work that has already occurred. In saying this is not a true baseline, this is, you know, we're not capturing the improvement that's already happened. And then also, like you said, if you don't know if it's improved or not, influence your data.
Any other suggestions on that one? I think this is a good response. It captures our previous conversation. Adam?
I mean, I think a factor here in how this is approached is scale too. So if it's like looking at specific locations where you can see there's a connection, the road and the stream, but I mean, it can also be evaluated at a bigger watershed scale too. In that case, I think that, yeah, that would still be useful. So maybe if you don't, I have no point. Basically, you figured out that. No. Will be effective. I guess that's.
Yeah. Appreciate that.
Yeah, if you're saying, if your question is, SFOs on the west side, what percentage of the roads are disconnected, from stream networks relative to BPFA, then it's true that we need to know, but if there's 5% of the work of this, 5% landowner have updated all their stream network, then maybe at the scale of all the SFOs on the west side, it's less of a factor, but we just, like to Amanda's point, if we're counting one on the other side of the equation, it makes the effectiveness of the conservation measure look less effective than two, because we're measuring it on the wrong side. That's like the simplest version.
I think what I'd love to see is for them to come to wrestle with this a little bit and figure out. And then come back to us with the best way to come up with a baseline and reasonings why.
Yeah.
They think that's the best way to come up with a baseline. And if they do their best to try to account for it and there's areas where they can't, then tell us why and why you got to the conclusion you did, and then we can say whether we think that's still good.
I feel that this answer captures that sentiment of we want to see more consideration of methods.
Me, it would include in this, maybe our answer getting too long, but we'd like to have the resolution of this issue detailed in the report, so we know things.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Maybe that's obvious, but knowing the treatment of the issue will be useful.
And I just feel like from a statistical perspective, you can look at your population and the outliers. And they can be in the results and, and you locate that this is an outlier and therefore it wasn't included in the quantitative result, in the comprehensive results. You don't just ignore it from being.
Julie?
I made a suggestion in the chat as well. Or I can say it now if that's easier.
And just a process point, it is lunch. Your lunch is probably sitting out in the hallway calling to you, and so about coming to a point where you have a lunch break there.
Let's finish this one and then we'll have a lunch break. Finish this one, now first question.
Yay.
We're good?
Well, yeah. I'd like you to.
What, Julie?
Yeah.
What was your?
Good.
Pull her suggestion back up, and she can talk. And walk us through it.
Well, I just, obviously they haven't thought of this in the way that we have, and so I thought we might as well give them that information that there is a records being kept of where that work has been done. And that, if you oversample initially, then you can eliminate those sites from your sample before you go out to do the work.
Yeah, I'm good with this, and I think that ultimately this is gonna be a thing they're gonna have to wrestle with. And I think there are, to Adam's point, based on scale, they could come back to us and tell us, here's how we recommend getting a baseline. And it doesn't, and because of the scale, like maybe they're gonna look at entire watershed, for example. And based on that, we know there's gonna be work that's going to occur. Now, we thought through this, and this is the way we think we can try to account for it. It's still gonna have an impact on things, but we think this is probably the best way to do it. The reasons are, A, B, C, D. And that's what our discussion was, and that's what we're bringing back to you. Yeah, so. Okay, with that, then let's break for lunch. How long do we typically break for lunch, Barry?
15 minutes.
So let's go quickly. It's 12:04, 12:05, right? 12:20. We will reconvene and keep going. 12:20. Yeah.
Thanks for the reminder. Recording is now going.
Yeah, thanks. So just thinking about the timing here for the remainder of the meeting. How much time, and I want to defer to you a little bit here, Terry, to help us manage the time. Knowing that we have a wrap up to do, we wanted to get through as many of these questions as we could, and then we also wanted to have that discussion and hopefully get to a point of approving the process for prioritizing research questions down the road. So with all of that in mind, and looking at the clock, and we have less than 40 minutes to go here.
Right.
What should we do?
Right. Well, I guess it's clear that responding to all these clarifying questions isn't going to happen. So maybe the thing to do is to kick that over to a work group. And then that's probably gonna need to happen even if you spent the rest of the time on these questions. And so then there's a question of, does the AMPC have capacity right now to have 2 work groups happening in parallel, or does the one that I suggested happen maybe get delayed about effectiveness monitoring in deference to getting this piece done first, and then maybe there's an AMPC special meeting sometime a month-ish from now, 4 to 7 weeks, just to finalize these responses to the IRST so that they can keep moving. So there's that, and then there's the piece on the proposing process to propose research questions the work group did. That's important, but also not urgent. On the other hand, shouldn't get delayed years, because then it gets stale and people forgot who did what and why. So having said all that, it probably makes sense to talk a little bit about next steps on addressing these clarifying questions is probably what I would suggest.
Any thoughts on that from the group? Stacy.
Yes, I'm curious. I appreciate hearing kind of starting some initial responses, maybe just a gauge from the room of, did these generally look okay, or were there ones that needed more discussion? Because I could see, maybe a special meeting in May, or I don't know, that we could just kind of work through these very quickly and finalize them, but I don't have a good read on much discussion.
Amanda.
I would be surprised if a lot of us didn't have some very similar opinions about a lot of these questions, so I'd be fine either picking it to a work group, or, if you have, really strong opinions about one, I mean, maybe it's as simple as sending it to Terry, and Terry has the capacity to look at all that, and if there's one that sticks out, like we got real different opinions about one, we bring that back to the larger group. So whichever way we want to do it, some of it's dependent on our own capacity as well as Terry's capacity, but I'm fine with but I think it will take a while to.
What if we did kind of oh, sorry, Wendy, go ahead.
So I was just thinking that the answering the questions from the IRST strikes me as a more urgent matter than the process for initiating research questions. So I was thinking maybe we should jump in right now and keep talking about the questions from the IRST and drop the other off the agenda.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I think we can get through some of them. If we need to go to a work group, we've got a sense then of how the group is thinking about the question in order to get our final set out there.
Is that okay? That would mean we kick that other discussion to the June meeting, which I don't disagree is the urgency there is probably not as great, given that we have plenty of priorities in front of us.
Yep.
Julie?
Yeah, I was gonna suggest if we don't get all the way through the questions from the IRST, Terry, would you be willing to send around the responses that you've already written, and then we can focus our responses to anything that's different than that?
Happy to, and I do have the capacity to, whether it's a work group or individual, and I coalesce, either way is fine with me. I think the question is what's going to be the best use of your folks' time in terms of trying to get something back to the IRST, quote unquote, soon, whether that's May 10th or I don't know what. But yeah, I think that makes sense.
Well, I like the suggestion of Wendy. It seems like that makes sense. Let's jump back into the questions and see how far we can get. And with that in mind, we will then postpone the last agenda item, which is the discussion and approval of our research questions process to the June meeting. And then spend the remainder of our time here trying to address the questions in front of us on the roads package. If we don't get to a resolution on that, where it's completely final, then we can talk about next steps at that point. Does that sound right or good? Okay, let's move forward then. Number 2, does the IRST have the latitude to use what we deem as best available science in developing monitoring methods and strategy? For example, can IRST replace the Barson model reported in methods used by Dubé et al. With another model or approach that the IRST determines to be more scientifically appropriate or efficient for the specific monitoring questions to be answered? So the draft answer is yes to both questions. Decisions regarding methods are the purview of the IRST. Anybody feeling differently there? Fine. Fantastic. Will a report containing information like that found in Dubé et al. Be sufficient to meet AMSI's expectations in hydrologic connectivity status? Its response, draft response, yes, with the caveat that the IRST needs to oversee development of a second summary report written for the layperson per OAR 629-603-0206G. Anything more to add there or thoughts? Good. Good. Okay. How do these levels vary based on landowner type, east-west region? IRST questions, comments are, please identify the land ownership categories that you would like to be considered here. Response, this is clarified in the original document sent to the IRST, section B5. Yeah, I thought we did that work already.
Good job, everybody.
Okay.
Isn't east-west part delineated as well?
But I think that's number 2.
Oh, ownership, right, okay, sorry, coming later.
Okay. Number 2, there may be other strata such as current geology within the east-west georegions that may be important for discerning differences in status and trends of hydrologic connectivity. Would the AMSI like the IRST to explore these strata? Note that the difficulty of obtaining an adequate sample size and the cost of sampling may increase with more strata. Draft response, the AMSI acknowledges that more information is helpful. However, the primary focus needs to be questions directly related to the FPA and secondarily on additional strata. Does the IRST think there are specific additional strata which would be crucial to assess as it relates to this work? So that's volleying another question back to them. Thoughts on this response? Josh?
Yeah, so they suggest stuff that, I think some of this we talked about, such as geology or soil types. So yeah, I mean, do we want to be collecting that sort of information? Sure. Could that go into analysis? Possibly, but that's going to depend on, you know, on the sample size and the variation within the samples as to whether that's useful, put into the analysis. So I don't know how the best way to phrase this. But yeah, like, would it be good to have that collected when you're characterizing the sample site? What's the parent geology? What's the soil? What's the slope of the ground, the native ground? In addition to the road information, sure. The question about whether or not that should be included in the analysis, whether we want to go from east-west, two landowner types, that gives us 4 categories, and we start throwing in parent geology, and now we're 4 times whatever the number of parent geologies are. Are we doing that as erodible resistant, or are we doing that as sandstones and mudstones? And one thing, metamorphic rocks is another, like basaltic is the third, and then all of a sudden we're adding another multiplier in there, so we end up with 5 parent geologies, and now we're at 4 times 5, 20 categories, and now we don't have any statistical power left.
Yeah.
So I think it's useful information to collect, but you really have to see the structure of the collected data to know what you can reasonably analyze for. So I think we want to get across, it's my opinion, I think we want to get across that could be useful information. Especially if we're seeing a pattern of, oh, this isn't working very well in erodible geologies, for example. But the primary focus is seeing that there's differences expressed.
Yeah, another way to phrase that is that parent geology shouldn't be part of the study design. Right?
Yeah.
Like you described.
Yeah, it should be collected.
Just as a code. Collected, but not
part of study.
And that's it potentially, right? We don't necessarily.
Not definitively, but again, we're still kind of, still deferred.
Julie?
Yeah, so on the one hand, I trust the expertise of these people to understand the statistical ramifications of having too many strata. On the other hand, I think it's worth saying that, you know, that we would caution that we're concerned, or that we have concern about the multiplicative nature of the strata, meaning that we wouldn't have the statistical power to address the core questions. So, you know, I could potentially see a design that they would come forward that included geology, that I would say, okay, yeah, that seems like a good way to go forward. Because it seems like the 2 things that vary the most east-west are climate and geology. I don't know that I want to completely shut the door on looking at that, but express some caution about how quickly strata can get out of control. Although I'd be willing to go with what was previously written too. I don't want to spend too much time on this.
I think what's important to capture is what the group, if I could summarize, I think what the group is more or less saying is the
Sorry about that.
yeah, you could go back. I think it's down right there.
Yeah, thanks. Yep.
The AMC, the core question relates to the FPA and the land ownership types and east-west. That needs to be prioritized. Additional strata may be helpful. And however, the AMC would caution against overloading the question with too much strata to get away from. This would be significant, I don't know, I'm not saying it right, but that would overload the question, and you wouldn't have the statistical power to make a conclusion. So I'm not saying it right, but I don't think we want to necessarily push them hard in the direction of a bunch of additional strata, but at the same time, we're not closing the door on that. And we do think that while you're out there, you should be measuring a bunch of different things and determine whether that can help inform a future question. For example, even if we don't have statistical power, if we're seeing someone with a trend that looks like it could be in a certain geological type or whatever, then we can direct a question in that area or whatever. But for this initial piece, it needs to make sure that they're staying true to the BFA or the FPA and the east-west small large.
That sounds good to me, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the end, you got it. I saw you circling in on Google before, that's it.
Yeah. And just quickly, one with design roads, the geologic parents trio really doesn't often come into the discussion. It's really the soils. And so there's certain ways you can quickly determine the competence, the relative competence in the soil that you're putting your road base over. And so I would just leave it the way you got it. And then it's up to them to determine to what level of exploration. That's what we do when you build the road. You rely on the geotechnical engineer to go as far as they need to go to give you the recommendations on where to build your road. And it can vary from project to project depending on where you are. And so I would just leave it. Your phraseology seems pretty general and reasonable for everyone to let them figure it out.
I'm sorry, I didn't see everybody's card. Amanda's got her card up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I actually would argue more firmly that no, we don't want those additional strata explored because we're not gonna change the forest practice rules based on that information. And at the end of the day, our goal here is to determine whether or not the rules that we have are effective. And I am not of the mind that, you know, however interesting from a scientific perspective that is, and as a forester, I think that these questions are, I would not be for updating our rules to now get into additional rules based on your soil type. And if that is where this would go, I would be adamantly against it. So what would the purpose be for us to collect that data other than helping foresters and road engineers and forest engineers make better decisions on an individual basis? And that's, again, not what our purpose here is. It's to inform.
Well, it could be a number of things, right? I mean, some of our responses, it can be related to rule changes. It could also be guidance updates, can also be fact sheets, could also be, different pieces like that. And so to the last thing you said, maybe there are some practices that would be best emphasized in certain areas, and others, coastal zone versus Cascades. I don't know, I'm just spitballing here, but it doesn't always have to result in a rule change. So I would put that out there.
I just think it provides us the opportunity to further explain and clarify to the IRFP that our goal here is really about the rules and about the FPA and measuring the effectiveness of those rules and those statutes. And so the further we get in adding additional strata, the further we get away from our core mission. So not just around the statistical significance, but around the goal of the adaptive management.
Yeah. I saw Adam's got a card up and then I see the.
I think Amanda has a really good point. I'm staying very focused on what we need out of this. I think that's kind of a want maybe from where it's an interesting question, but just from a process standpoint, I think the more we can focus, and if it's too vague, it potentially opens up the door for some additional work that we may not necessarily get a whole lot of value out of, so. Anyway, yeah, I think that's a really good one.
Yeah, so I think, you know, like parent geology, soil type, that is all stuff that if I had a set of GPS coordinates, I can go onto the web soil survey, for example, and get that information and pull it for my own analysis. I suspect runnable soil types are contributing to poor performance in roads. I could actually go pull soil types for each site, do that analysis. Is there a significant effect of soil type on road connectivity? That's an analysis I can do with data. So I think what we want them to be focusing on is, one, the initial study design is east-west, small, large. And then if there's other stuff that might be of interest, we would want it to focus on things that have to be collected in the field, not something that is already available and can be pulled based on the coordinates of the sample site, right? So are there other things that we haven't thought of that need to be collected in the field? Then that's what we want to bring to us. If it's just, these might be other analyses that can be done based on, you know, already available information. They're not going to be digging soil beds at each of these sample sites, right? They're not determining soil type. That's already been done. We already have that data that exists. So I don't know how to get to this wording wise, but David seems to be doing pretty well. So David over there, but yeah, is there additional field data that needs to be collected? Because we can do those kind of like taking a look at other factors in subsequent analyses, but we're focused on this first step right now, east, west, small, large. Yeah, are we missing something that has to be collected in the field? That's what I think.
So is the purple and the red, that's back to me, right?
Yes.
Are those two different, are you suggesting in your response there, to get rid of the red and go with purple? Or two different options, it's not just, because it looks like some of that repeat.
Sure,
Right.
the red was Terry's first stab. The purple is my transcription of what has been said here, and so some combination thereof, I think, is the answer.
The question,
I was gonna, I guess it's a,
Go ahead.
maybe, I was gonna do the like wrap up on this one, which it feels like was, our original conversation was, what are the, along your lines is, what are the things that differ in the OFPA? And it was small and large, small and big, and then east and west, because we wanted to see if things are gonna change, what are they related to? And the other stuff is handy to know, but that's a different level of conversation than the detail of the baseline. Which is, so in other words, I think we've captured it, but de-emphasizing other variables and focusing on, these are the areas that the OFPA is related to.
is everybody comfortable with that last question? So I think if you take the pink out or red or whatever, the Terry's part, I think Terry, you've, our conversations kind of reiterated that. So if you just go start with the purple.
Yep.
And then really we're kind of circling around that last question. After however because I think everybody agreed from what I hear, the core question relates to PFA based landowner types, east-west type, and east-west geography. So these factors must be prioritized. That I hear agreement on from everybody.
Yep.
The AMC would caution against additional strata that would detract from the ability to address those factors. I think everybody agrees on that as well. So then there's just this last question. However, the AMC would be interested in IRC opinion on use of additional strata covariates or metrics that would be field collected.
That would be must be, because I think there's a difference that I think what Josh trying to get across was that while they're there, what do we know
Are there
already?
things that they could.
But since you're there, you can get them there.
Yeah, it would have to be done there.
Yeah, so that's the word must, I like that.
I just want to make sure people understand, never designed a road. You can't go to a wet soil survey and get information to design the road. We have to get field collected data. So I mean, and I would be hesitant in telling a professional who you can't even do it, if we're gonna, you know, evaluate the competence of the road. So that's the way you've got it listed there. You're asking for their opinion of what it is they want. We don't have to take their opinion, but you know, you don't want to constrain somebody in kind of what they can or cannot do. When you're trying to evaluate the competency of something. That's what I see for what folks are talking about. And so.
Okay, Amanda, your card's back up.
Yeah, I just wanna kind of work us back to the beginning. You know, this question from the IRST is about the strata, right? It's not about other things that are gonna be measured at the site. There's gonna be a lot of other things that are measured to measure hydrologic connectivity or disconnectivity. So I would probably just remove that and focus more on the question at hand, which is around the strata.
I think that's a fair point, because originally I was also thinking about it not as strata, but more as additional information. But the question really is about the strata. We wouldn't want them to stratify
Yeah,
based on that,
yeah.
for this question, right? Unless I'm missing something. I think that's.
I think
we don't
they're
want
just
them-
saying that.
I don't want them to
would be
further gratify,
Yeah.
otherwise that would.
Yeah, we don't want
the,
further strata.
yeah. So,
I think just removing that last, because it's, again, they're gonna collect a lot of work. I think we don't need to get into the details of what is required to get at the connectivity issue. Yeah.
Partitioning site or our goals, yeah.
okay, Terry, we are at 12:47. We have 13 minutes remaining.
And this is our next question to them, like they have a question essentially that what other variables are there, so.
So I guess, I think what makes sense is because you're about halfway through the document. Unless you all want to stay for an extra half hour, 45 minutes, which I'm guessing you probably don't. What makes sense to me is see if you can approve those answers as a group. And this is even a little bit gray area, whether or not it's a substantial decision. You haven't predefined that. So question of how you want to go about making a decision, and are you ready to make a decision on that first batch of questions to send back? And then what's the next step of the process to finalize the rest of the answers?
So I would rather us err on the side of being overly cautious and be able to speak as a group. And say, these are our responses that we approved as a group. Than not. And so my preference, and we haven't talked about this, but my preference would be to go ahead and, move this through a substantial decision process and just vote on it. And then the IRST has the confidence that this is coming from the AMC, not from individuals on the AMC, but the AMC as a whole. And I think we could do that for the first half of the document, and then we could talk about, so any pushback on that, or everybody comfortable with that? So with that in mind, Terry, can you scroll back up? We've just gone through all of these. And I don't know if so is there any, I don't know, can we do it this way and just say, is there any, we've now wordsmithed the answers here. So we've gone through it just fresh with everybody. Does anybody have any heartburn over these responses being sent back to IRST as AMC responses?
That's for baseline report, A and B.
Yes, that's for baseline report, A and B. That's
Yep, 1A, 1B.
Or whatever is the. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm seeing consensus. I'm hearing consensus. So I think we can, I don't know, what's as a process, do we need to take a vote for that, Terry?
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a vote.
If you want to be a substantial decision, it's a vote.
Yeah, I would move that we send as responses to questions 1A and 1B to IRST as part of the the formal process of responding.
Do I have a second for that motion?
You know what I mean?
A
I'll second.
Dave? There we go. So let's go ahead and call if there's any discussion before I. Nope, not hearing any. Terry, you wanna call the order?
Sure. Seth Barnes,
Yes.
David Bugney,
Yes.
Stacy Detweiler,
Yeah.
Julie Furman,
Yep.
Wendy Gerlach,
Yes.
Casey Kula,
Yes.
Jason Robison,
Yes.
Josh Seeds,
Yes.
Amanda Sullivan Astor,
Yes.
William Tucker.
Yes.
All right,
Motion.
thank you, everyone. So for the second half of this document, responding to the questions. I think we need to do that sooner rather than later, right, Terry? So
That's
can
preferred.
we find a time on the calendar where we could organize just a 1 hour, and this one for this meeting, I think it would just be a sort of a 1 hour online, no encouraging even to come in person, because it's just a short period of time. Meeting where we could go through these. Does that make sense? And if that does make sense, can we just find a date right now that works for people, date, time? You want to throw out a date, time, Terry, that well,
Sure. Give me 10 seconds here to pull up my calendar. So how about the afternoon of Monday, May 6th?
Works for me.
Good for me.
Okay, with me, except not at 2 o'clock.
Not at 2 o'clock.
Commissioner Tucker will not be here. He'll be out of the country, unfortunately, that day.
Okay. When approximately from when to when are you gone then?
So the last week of April and the first week and a half of May are bad.
Gotcha.
But I have confidence in your answers, Terry, and I have confidence in this group that I would certainly either have my proxy sit in, but I'm not sure that to get up to speed quickly would be worth it. I would have confidence in this group.
Okay. With that in mind, I mean, we could just. If it works for everyone else, does it work for everyone else? The afternoon of the 6th, with the exception of a 2 o'clock. So we're looking at like what time, Terry?
Say 3 o'clock. Is that a good time,
3 to
Wendy?
4? 3 to 4 on the 6th?
Yeah. And Terry, if you get me your comments today or next couple days, I'll get back to you, or get back to Seth and you.
Perfect.
Yes, yeah, I'll send those out for everyone to provide me feedback, and then I'll coalesce everything and even point out where there might be a little more discussion, and I'll send out everyone's responses as well.
Excellent. That would be helpful. So we'll target that date. Thank you, Commissioner Tucker, for your flexibility there. And yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, so with that, let's move on to wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, really, in terms of wrapping up, I'm looking at my notes here. We know what's in front of us with the work group on effectiveness monitoring, and then the finalizing the rest of the responses to the IRST, clarifying questions on the roads package. I guess the only other question is, hopefully we can start in June to dive into the Eastern Oregon steep slopes question package. Ideally, there'd be folks who would look at it ahead of time. Just as a reminder, that was a good 8 or 9 months ago. So everyone, including me, is probably kind of rusty on those. So could have a work group meet ahead of time to discuss it and maybe polish it a little bit is an idea. I'm also hearing people being a little maxed out over the next couple of months. So I guess I'm curious to hear what folks think about how best to proceed with those, that Eastern Oregon steep slopes question package.
Here's my 2 cents. I would say let's take it to the June meeting and we'll see how far we can get. I mean, remember that, so we did have some discussion with that. If you could send out where we left that off at beforehand and everybody could commit to review that, I think that would be useful. And then I think it's also important to remember that this one, it was fairly specific in the, it's a job we have to prioritize a question around a literature review. That would then obviously, you know, once you get that literature review back, it would then beg the question of where we go from here. And so the point is, we don't have to have all of that like completely sussed out. As long as we get them a question to do a literature review, I think we're on track here. So hopefully it's not too difficult or left to try to get there even without a work group in June.
I know.
Jason?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, is it worth adding an extra 20 minutes to our May 6th meeting to do a quick overview, just to get everyone up to speed, not spend a lot of detail on it since we're going into June, but just maybe an extra overview?
I'm open to that.
We could do that. So that's a good idea, Jason. I like that idea. So maybe Terry, if you could prepare something for us for that day.
Sure. Yep.
And then, maybe we'll try to get it done within the hour. Like maybe we can, within an hour, we can get through the roads question and that. But if not, then maybe budget for an hour and a half, I guess, for that meeting, with the idea that we'll try to keep it to an hour if possible.
Okay, sounds good.
But we're not talking about any substantial decision or really even much of a discussion. It would just be getting up to speed, you know, just a refresher.
Yep.
Just for the public's sort of tracking.
Yep.
Okay, does that bring us to the end?
Yep.
Thanks for your work today, everyone, especially Terry, in preparing for the meeting today, and appreciate the catering and all those who. Very good. And we're adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.